one of the many worlds in the universe, began to crumble into tiny pieces. The situation spiraled out of control the moment the pillar that held everything together collapsed. In his quest, the hero had to cross many spheres and thousands of worlds. Each of them collapsed into small shards. Each time it was necessary to create everything anew. The hero had to take on the burden of caring for humanity. A temple was built on a small island hovering high in outer space. A young man in a blue robe sat in a lotus posture in the sky and meditated. From the outside, it looked like he was hanging on an invisible carpet just in the air. He was destined to awaken in the primordial chaos and become a teacher for humanity. He sat with his eyes closed and felt bursts of energy around him. The hero sat like that for a while longer, building up energy before he considered the awakening timely. The young man began to slowly open his eyes. The energy artifact located on the roof of the pagoda reached its peak. There was a massive release of energy, and the stronghold of civilization exploded. This led to the fact that the hero was also thrown from heaven to earth, and he had to create a new world here. The islet, along with the pagoda temple, moved leisurely across the firmament. The young man thought that this place would be suitable and opened the portal. On the other side of the portal, things looked different. His pagoda moved into the earthly celestial space, and the portal immediately closed. The day was sunny, and green fields with forests spread wide below. The hero himself did not know what was in store for him this time. Perhaps he would become the greatest ruler of mankind. He imagined building a temple for himself the size of a city, and all the power of the world would belong to him alone. Suddenly, another thought crossed the hero's mind. He thought that he could raise a worthy successor and find a man worthy to rule this world. But there was another possibility. There was no need to fight. The hero saw himself towering over a mountainous, rushing river. He immediately dismissed the idea. The hero stood on the pillar of civilization, which at the same time was instead of a pedestal for him. He gazed dreamily into the distance and admired the landscape. After a while, the white-haired young man closed his eyes. He had to concentrate on what was important, and nothing was to distract him. The azure robe fluttered in the gusts of wind. The hero shouted to the sky that all he needed was a girl apprentice to rub his master's back. It seemed very easy to accomplish. Unfortunately, the first student turned out to be a young and strong macho man dashing around the neighborhood with his sword. The third apprentice turned out to be a shota, and that too made the hero sad. This was not an option for him either. He needed a girl. Of course, the question arises as to what happened to the second student. He was a very handsome student who outshone his beauty and smiled playfully. But the hero had to by no means succumb to temptation and not let his mind be clouded and fall for a smarmy face. The blonde-haired world dweller clasped his fingers together and prayed, asking the heavens where he could find the one and only female student who could meet his needs. Suddenly, somewhere in this dimension, as if responding to the hero's call, a certain girl looked around warily. She had light pink hair with a strange style. The girl was wearing a rather daring dress. With her high self-esteem, she couldn't help but notice that someone behind her back was praising her charms. The moon hung over the city. Night had fallen. The stars glittered alternately in the darkness. Ominous clouds thickened over the night city. Not everyone in the city was asleep at this late hour. The girl the hero had chosen to be his apprentice was practicing hard at night. She was fleeing from pursuit and running as hard as she could. The girl's face flushed red with exertion, sweat beading on it. Meanwhile, the men who were chasing her knew no fatigue at all. They chased her along the roofs of the houses, occasionally taking to the air. After running across another rooftop, one of them pushed off and habitually soared into the air. The man wore dark clothes. His face was concealed by a hooded mask, a sword hanging behind his back. It couldn't go on like this for long, and after a while the stalker was almost on par with the girl. When he was above her, he began to draw his sword. The girl ran on in a huff. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw that the man was close by. She could do nothing. He was clearly moving faster. The girl was only distracted for a moment. It was enough for her to catch the toe of her boot on a small boulder in the road. The moment the girl was already falling to the sidewalk, the stalker flew even closer and landed on the roof of a small house right above her. The second man began to dive at the girl. With one hand, he began to draw his sword. The stalker put his other hand in the girl's direction. The agitated girl immediately turned to face the man and covered herself with her hands. She begged to be left alone. At the moment when death seemed imminent, there was a sudden clang of blades. Their swords crossed in a duel. The girl trembled and awaited her fate. At the moment of impact, she was sure that her soul was on its way to heaven. The girl could not believe that she was alive, and she opened one eye incredulously. Finally, she realized what was happening. Her eyes opened very wide with surprise. She stared at her savior in amazement. A tall, dark-haired man in a straw hat and dark clothes with brightly colored gold inlays cut in at the last moment with his sword. The girl looked puzzled at the men's fight. She was already sitting on the sidewalk, her fear of near death beginning to fade. The stranger in the straw hat was concentrating on holding back the onslaught of the enemy. Swords clashed against each other, and the pursuer could not cope. Suddenly the man made a leap forward, and the pursuer flew backwards in surprise, letting go of his sword. He fell on his back right next to his partner, discouraging him from continuing the fight. The second pursuer realized that their forces were unequal. He helped his partner up and said they had better leave. The stalker turned around on the run and told the man in the straw hat that they would meet again. The girl tucked her legs under her and looked at her accidental savior with embarrassment. A slight blush appeared on her cheeks. She marveled at how quickly the stranger had dispatched his pursuers. The girl marveled at how quickly the stranger had dispatched the pursuers. Several months had passed since the unpleasant incident. The moon had risen, illuminating one of the estates enclosed by a tall yellow fence. Above the central gate was a large plaque with large hieroglyphics that could be seen from afar. The spiders had made their home nearby. The girl with pink hair was relaxed and was taking her bath, humming a song in a contented voice. Her knees were sticking out of the water. It felt so good to be in the warm water that she closed her eyes in pleasure and threw her head back. When she had finished her bath, the girl finally allowed herself to open her eyes. Her heated face was crimson, and drops of water were dripping down her hair. The girl began to reluctantly leave her wooden tub and rested her hand on its edge. The water from her wet hand slowly dripped down the surface of the tub. As she began to wrap herself in the white sheet, the girl couldn't contain her wat-song and exclaimed how good it felt to take a bath. Covering herself from the front with a sheet, the girl climbed out of the tub. She felt nice and good. The mood was wonderful, and the girl kept humming a song. The girl's naked body was clearly visible through the open window of the house. The streetlights provided enough illumination for that. The observer took advantage of this. He quickly sketched the silhouette of a half-covered girl walking away with a pencil on a piece of paper. The artist turned out to be a fair-haired hero. He sat comfortably on the roof of the house opposite, with his legs hanging down, and watched the object of his attention, drawing her from different angles. The result of the hero liked the result very much. He could not contain his pleasure and lustfully licked himself. His eyes lit up with excitement. Suddenly, the blonde-haired hero had to stop drawing his sketches, and he didn't quite like it. A certain young man in white clothes with brown hands knocked on the girl's door. The girl did not open the door, and he kept knocking. He was a tall young man with pink hair. He was dressed in white golden clothes and held a sword with a scabbard of the same golden color in his hand. His name was Tao Er. She recognized her older brother's voice and asked him embarrassedly to wait. She hadn't had time to get dressed yet. The girl recognized her older brother's voice and asked him to wait. Embarrassed, the young man didn't seem to hear her and continued to bang on the door. He waited impatiently for the girl to open the door for him. Finally, Tao peeked out from behind the door, wrapped in a white sheet. She said hello to her brother and asked what he wanted from her. The girl invited her older brother into the house and quickly made a hot drink for him. They sat at a small table. The young man expressed his concern that Tao Er had decided to stay here and said that he would like to meet her savior. He hinted that this place was quite remote. Tao assured that her brother really had nothing to worry about. That gentleman is really very strong and can protect her. The young man reproached his sister for being too naive. She had not recognized the man at all, but she began to bow to him and call him mentor, which was all he had been waiting for. Tao assumed that the Lord had taken on her training because the girl was unusually gifted. The young man objected that they hadn't seen a single disciple in a few days. Besides, absolutely nothing is known about this temple of heavenly will, and he is worried about Tao Er. Mentor decided it was time to show himself, got down to the ground and walked into the house. He stopped at the threshold and coughed delicately, drawing attention to himself. The girl immediately jumped up, greeted him cheerfully, and rushed over to him. The young man remained seated near the table. His sword lay beside him. Master said hello to Tao Er and Mr. Su. He noticed that it was quite late and they were still awake. Su bowed to his mentor as a sign of special respect and said hello. He hesitated and did not know how to explain his visit to his sister at such a late hour. Ji Yan admitted that he had heard about what was troubling Mr. Su. He couldn't afford to give up the Tao Er he had found with such difficulty. The blonde-haired mentor coughed meaningfully again. He had to buy a few seconds and think of something. He explained to Su that the temple was rather deserted now, as he had only accepted personal disciples since the founding of his teachings. Jie Yan smiled welcomingly and told him that by happy coincidence, a few of them would be returning to the temple today. He told Tao Er that tomorrow her master would introduce the girl to his senior students. Tao Er was embarrassed and blushed again. The next day, Yan kept his promise and led Tao Er and her brother Su to his temple high in the mountains. They walked along a mountain path among the rocks. Around the beaten path, everything around them was blooming and green. Su found this place very strange. Something rustled in the bushes. The brother and sister immediately turned their heads in excitement. Su grabbed his sword. A young man in white and blue robes and gray pants suddenly jumped out of the thicket. He had a sword hanging behind his back. The young man took one leap to the nearest tree, quickly ran up its trunk, and sat down on a branch, viewing the guests from a safe distance. Yan waved his hand in a friendly manner. He assured Yuling that he didn't need to be afraid. It's just his little sister student, and no one is going to harm him. Lin felt sick to his stomach. He turned pale at the thought of his mentor bringing a sissy who would be studying with him. Tao Er embarrassedly waved her hand to greet him and said that she was happy to see him. Yulin's worst fears had come true. This creature was a woman after all. He shouted angrily and ran away. The girl looked at the young man with a puzzled expression. She couldn't understand what had scared Lin so much. The girl turned to her mentor and asked him who this strange student was. Su also looked at Yan with interest, and he told a short story. It was one of his apprentices, 20 years ago, who had gone to earn money. The young man was caught during the 9 Fei and was used as a living elixir for alchemy. Yan added that all the juices had been squeezed out of him. Of the 200 jin of weight, only 120 were left. So now the young man was frightened by the sight of the girl, so he ran away. Su snorted. It was disgusting to him that the witches from the 9 Heavens current were involved here. Tao Er didn't understand a word of the story. Yan said enviously that his disciple had served as an elixir for a crowd of young beauties for 7 whole years. Looking at the faces of his companions, he corrected himself and said that it annoyed him. The 3 of them walked through the courtyard. Yan said that they should cross the gallery, and young Tao happily followed her teacher. A small, thick tree stood in the middle of the courtyard. On one side of the tree were stones. On the other side of the tree, a young man was leaning on the trunk of the tree, which caught Su's attention. A young man in a brown cloak stood in the shade of a tree chewing on a blade of grass. His appearance was concealed by a straw hat. Yan walked ahead and told his companions that they now had to turn the other way and invited them to follow him. Tao caught her brother's gaze and turned toward the tree as well. Seeing the young man, she tugged the teacher's sleeve and asked with interest who the strange young man standing under the tree was. Yan assured the girl that there was no need to pay much attention to that person. It was just her senior classmate, Mo Junhen. The master recalled one of the fights with that young man and regretfully narrated that Junhen's head was not right. It turned out that the young man constantly fantasizes about being the first fencer in the Celestial Empire. Although in reality, Junhen is unable to even withstand Yan's own attacks provided they fight on equal footing. Tao Er couldn't contain her amazement. She involuntarily moved even closer to her mentor and expressed her delight. The girl embarrassedly exclaimed that she hadn't even thought of such a master's power before. Yan found the girl very seductive and opened his mouth. He couldn't be happy that he had found such a charming little girl to apprentice with. The master's eyes were burning with desire. Su carelessly pointed towards Junin and asked what that warrior was doing now if he was meditating. Jianhen had been covertly watching them all this time. He slightly lifted his straw hat for a better view and snorted contemptuously. Su kept turning around and looking at Mo. The mentor said that Jianhen wasn't doing anything at all right now. He turned around, gave Su a friendly smile, and explained that he usually called people with this behavior show-offs. Tao assumed that both students had their own peculiarities. Su said that peculiarities was still too soft-sounding. After a while, Master Yan stopped with his hand behind his back and announced that he would now introduce the highlight of the program to them. He turned to his brother and sister, and hesitantly said that in a certain sense this man could be considered quite normal. The mentor knew that that student was actually the most unique, and one could only hope that he wouldn't cause more trouble. Passing the gallery, they found themselves again among thick grass and trees. Yan said that there was another person ahead whom he wished to introduce to Tao Er. Su frowned. He saw that this place was too strange, and the disciples themselves are worthy of each other, one more abnormal than the other. Su saw that his little sister was getting too excited about all this, and thought that he would have to take Tao Er away from here after all. The master smiled and waved at them in a friendly manner. Yan said that they had reached their goal, and had come to the right place. Tao opened her eyes wide with delight. She immediately liked this place. Everything was beautiful and unusual. In one corner of the garden in front of them, a sakura bloomed. The girl had never seen such a fanciful color of its petals before. There was also a small pond, and fish of various names were splashing around, occasionally surfacing to meet the rays of the sun. Across the pond, a zigzag path on stilts led to a small gazebo. There was someone sitting at a small table. An oblong, 6-stringed instrument was placed on a table, and the man sitting in the gazebo was musing on it in an inspired manner. It was a girl with ash-colored hair tied in a ponytail with a green cloth. Smiling, she strummed the strings, and the melody echoed sadly throughout the neighborhood. The girl closed her eyes. It was easier for her to adapt to the musical rhythm. The girl extracted notes that penetrated into the soul, and everyone listened to the melody, holding their breath. Tao Air opened her eyes wide and exclaimed that the girl was simply beautiful. She thought that she would have fallen in love with her if she were a young man. Yan just stared. He knew what kind of girl this was. After all, it was his own disciple that he was going to introduce to the girl. Su was also amazed by the performer of the music. The music sounded not bad at all, but the girl was really a real beauty. He walked closer and realized that his hunch was correct. Su had not seen such a beautiful girl for a long time, and it would be nice to be friends with her. All three of them approached the girl who was playing. When she saw them, she immediately stopped playing and put her instrument aside. The girl bowed politely and folded her hands in respect. She said hello to the master and smiled warmly. Tao kept exclaiming that the girl was very beautiful. Yan told Bai Yulan that this was his youngest fellow student, Su Tao Air. She would be the master's new apprentice. Pointing his finger at the young man, the mentor said that he was Tao Air's elder brother, and he was also an honored guest of the Temple of Heaven's Will. Bai gently looked into Su's eyes and thanked him for the visit. This did not go unnoticed. The young man blushed and said hello to the young lady. He began to tell her that his name was Su Xuan, and he was a figure from the capital. Suddenly, Tao Air slapped him hard on the back. Surprised, Su was silent for a while and turned to his sister in surprise. She said that Su had gotten too nervous. The brother started to guffaw and joked that he hadn't even noticed it himself. Bai smiled. The girl said that the sister disciple could call her Tao Air from now on. She couldn't resist complimenting Bai that she was pretty. Lan smiled and said hello to her. Bai Lan looked in front of him and smiled at his brother and sister. He kept waiting for them to figure out what was wrong on their own. But they were both completely confused by his appearance. Lan turned his head faintly toward his mentor and looked at him with a sidelong glance. Yan reluctantly noted to himself that he understood the reason for his gaze. Bai wanted the master to delicately point out their joint mistake to the guests. Yan regretfully recognized that it was time to end the performance. The mentor covered his eyes and coughed delicately, drawing attention to himself. He called Tao Air over to him and said that there was something she needed to know. Master smiled and said that in fact, Bai Lan was not really her fellow sister at all. Su didn't pay any attention to his words. Tao was very surprised. Master Yan added that Lan was her brother-in-law. Bai stood there, playfully twirling his hair around his finger. The brother and sister were furious. They had both been taken in by a handsome young man just because he had a pretty face. And if Tao Air was just disappointed, Su was just tearing his hair out in frustration. He couldn't believe that he had almost fallen in love with the young man's face. Tao automatically almost called him her sister. She corrected herself and asked the brother student if he was actually a guy with that appearance. Yan explained that Bai Lan looked like a girl from birth. He asked him to remember it well, and not to make the same mistake in the future. Su almost cried. His face creased with annoyance. He asked Lan if he was sure he was really a guy. Bai Lan winked at him coquettishly and assured him that it was actually true. He had been a guy since birth. Su couldn't hold back the urges of his stomach, and he vomited. The young man was disgusted with himself for thinking such thoughts about Bai. It was good that he had managed to move a little to the side. Tao Air immediately came running to his aid and asked what was wrong with him. Su was red with tension and said that he was fine. He was actually angry with himself. After all, Lan's appearance had made his heart beat harder, and Su couldn't forgive himself for that. Su turned to the master and told the abbot that the time was not early, so he and his sister would go rest for now. Tao waved goodbye to her master and apprentice brother on the run, almost calling him sister again. Bai Lan and Yan smiled. Master reminded the girl that class would start early tomorrow morning and asked her not to be late. As soon as the guests left, Mentor Yan frowned. Bai Lan continued to smile peacefully. He was amused by the situation. Master Yan turned to him and asked the young man sternly if he had memorized well all the things his mentor had warned him about earlier. Bai folded his hands in appreciation and bowed to his mentor. He said that he understood absolutely everything. Yan didn't have to worry. The master warned Lan to never show his true nature or scare his little sister apprentice, or else he would get a reprimand. Yan turned around and said that he had to go and finalize some preparations. An excited Bai Lan wished him a happy journey. It was morning at the Temple of Heavenly Will. All the disciples gathered in the center of the octagonal platform with the yin and yang symbolism in the center. Yu Lin was hiding behind one of the pillars closer to the brick wall of the temple. Mo Junin leaned on the other side of it, pulling his straw hat over his eyes. Master sat down in the lotus posture and solemnly announced that he would teach the spiritual comprehension of Tao Air starting this very day. Yan explained by way of introduction that people aspiring to become celestials could be on one of the 7 stages, and listed them by name. Tao Air was hiding behind one of the pillars, and the mentor frowned. Traditionally, master and apprentice were supposed to sit opposite each other. Yan told the girl that she was too far away from him, and therefore would not be able to hear her master's instructions clearly. Tao Air peeked out with one eye from behind the pillar. The girl's face was red with shame. In a stammering voice, she clarified whether the clothes were definitely Taoist robes. Junhen and Lin watched the girl surreptitiously. Tao asked indignantly why the socks were so long and the skirt too short in this outfit. The mentor looked at her condescendingly and smirked. He told Tao that there was still a lot she didn't understand, so she thought it was strange. Yan said that this Taoist garment was the personal creation of her master. It took a lot of mental and creative effort to make it. The mentor noticed that Tao started to hesitate and pressed on. He added that there was no need to reject the master's benevolence. The girl noticed that Yan was starting to get angry and gave in. She said that she trusted her mentor and would wear these clothes if it was so necessary. The embarrassed girl sneaked out from behind the column. Still, she felt that the clothes did not conceal anything and that it was indecent to walk in them. This Taoist garment had an overly wide neckline, held together by one honest-to-goodness and one button fastened at the very throat. The skirt, on the other hand, was so short that it was necessary to constantly cover oneself with one's hand to avoid indecent stares. Stammering, the girl still told her mentor that this garment made her very uncomfortable. She felt out of place. Tao Er's face turned the same shade as her hair with embarrassment. Tao Er's face was the same color as her hair, and she almost cried in embarrassment and begged the master not to wear the dress. The mentor had told Tao that this form had a positive effect on her cultivation, and she would realize it herself. The sight of Tao did not leave Yan indifferent, and his nose bled. The girl sat on one of the designated seats on the platform in the lotus position and covered the hem of her dress with both hands. She said that even so, she felt restless. Mentor sat down opposite her in the same assigned seat and folded his legs under him as well. They sat in silence for a while. Tao, burning with shame, looked down at the floor. Finally, she looked up and asked the master if wearing this uniform could really help her training. She realized for herself that it was uncomfortable for meditation. Wiping away the blood with the handkerchief he had saved beforehand, Yan noticed that Tao had put on her uniform incorrectly, and so it was creased. His eyes lit up with intense desire. Tao offered to do his best to help smooth out those folds. After a while, the sky darkened and rain clouds appeared. A few minutes passed, and the first drops of heavenly moisture fell to the ground. The training at the Temple of Heavenly Will continued. Mentor Yan told the new novice about the history of the temple and its teachings. At the same time, Su leisurely strolled along the stone-paved path that led to one of the gates that opened the way to the training ground. Suddenly, someone called out to him from behind, and Su was alert. From the voice, he thought it was the guy from yesterday who looked like a girl. It was indeed Bai Lan. The young man held a fan in his hand. Smiling, he asked what reason had prompted Mr. Su to come to this place. Su was embarrassed. He couldn't look at Bai's face calmly. He explained that he suddenly remembered something very important, and he needed to discuss it urgently with Tao. Su confessed that he actually wants to take his sister away from here, but the girl is determined to stay and won't listen to anything. Turning his back to Lan, Su clenched his fists and strode away. Bai looked at the young man in surprise. He had interrupted their conversation so abruptly. Su told him that he couldn't stay and protect his sister all the time. This time he would just say goodbye to Tao. The embarrassed girl was standing in front of her mentor at this time. Kneeling down, Yan licked greedily and adjusted the folds on the hem of Tao dress. Fortunately, Su didn't see any of this and only intended to enter the set. He told Bai that he didn't have to worry about Tao because she was perfectly safe here. Su was already close to the temple door and reached out his hand to open it. But Bai's sudden call to stop confused him, and he froze in place. Su turned around and saw that Bai Lan had swung his fan at him and intended to hit him. He tried to calm down Brother Lan and raised his hands in a friendly manner. A confused Su asked Bai what was going on and the reason for his aggressive behavior. The Lan hesitated and began to think of an urgent reason to keep Su inside. Bai winked conspiratorially at Su and put his finger to his lips, urging him to shut up and take it on faith. Lan turned to Su politely. He clarified that the master was now teaching a class, and he would be very upset if an outsider found out about his effective techniques. Su couldn't just stare at the young man's face. He blushed and admitted that Lan was completely right and he had been too rash in his decision. Bai Lan was glad that he was able to change his interlocutor's mind so quickly and take his side. He shook Su's hand firmly in gratitude. Lan said that such an occasion was rare and suggested walking together for a while. Without waiting for a reply, he pulled Su in the opposite direction. A thoroughly embarrassed Su stopped himself from thinking that Bai Lan was a guy after all. He blushed all red from internal tension. He didn't understand how Bai Lan could be a young man with such a graceful, girlish figure and such long, lovely hair. Bai's voice interrupted him from his thoughts. He was kindly noticing that Mr. Su was sweating too much. Su was indeed covered in sweat from worry. Not only his face, but also his hands were inordinately moist. He noticed that he was not used to the climate here. Lan asked Mr. Su to stand still and not move. Meanwhile, he went under the folds of his clothes. Lan took out a purple handkerchief, walked closer to Su, and asked Susan's permission to help him. Lan reached for Su's face with his handkerchief, and this caused the young man to be even more confused. He was simply thrown into a fever. Lan extended his hand with his handkerchief and at the same time winked playfully at Su. The young man noted that Lan's eyelashes were too long, making him look even more like a girl. Su suddenly bounced back. He couldn't afford such incomprehensible displays of kindness. Lan dropped the handkerchief from his hand in surprise. Su immediately announced to Bai that he would do it himself. Before he could even blink his eyes, the boy went to fetch the handkerchief. As soon as the handkerchief slipped out of Bai's hands, Su immediately calculated the situation and quickly rushed after the purple handkerchief. Pushing off the ground, Su caught the handkerchief in a powerful leap. This saved him from a fatal fall to the ground. After landing with the handkerchief in his hand, Su turned around and walked towards Lan. He was glad that he had done a good deed and saved the handkerchief for the young man. But at the same time, he was a little ashamed of both his behavior and his thoughts towards this effeminate young man. Su ran up to Bai, happily waving his hand in which the handkerchief was clasped, and informed Lan that the handkerchief was fine. Dying of shame, Su approached Lan and held out his hand with the handkerchief, returning the item to its owner. Su felt like falling under the ground. Lan smiled politely and thanked Mr. Su fervently for his courtesy. The young man reached out his hand for his handkerchief, but instead of simply taking the handkerchief from the young man's hands, Lan casually touched his fingers to Mr. Su's hand, as if by accident. Su was sweating even more. When he realized that their hands were touching, he jumped back in surprise and dropped the handkerchief. Lan said fearfully. The handkerchief drifted away again. Su turned around and frowned at the handkerchief circling in a gust of wind and slowly sinking to the ground. Bai folded his hands in front of him pleadingly and looked at Su tenderly. He asked the young man to help him and bring him the handkerchief that had been carried away by the wind. Su automatically rushed out of his seat. He was happy to favor the young man and assured that it wouldn't be a problem. He would bring it over in a flash. Suddenly, an unpleasant thought crossed Su's mind. He frowned and asked himself what he was doing now, but it was too late to retreat. Su was sweating even more. He couldn't understand what was happening to him right now. Besides the fact that what was happening wasn't quite right, Su also felt joyful about it all. The young man walked over to the handkerchief and stood over it, frowning. He caught himself thinking that he even wanted to earn Lan's gratitude. Right now, two natures were fighting within him. Su's first nature took the second one by the collar, shook him, and urged him to pull himself together. Su reproached himself that he should not have embarrassed himself like that. Arguing with himself, Su came to the conclusion that this man was too scary, and one should adamantly reject his signs of attention. That thought sobered his mind, and Su happily told himself that he did. He should just refuse Lan. Meanwhile, Su still bent down to the ground for his handkerchief. He was on his knees, handkerchief in hand, and couldn't understand why he was allowing himself to be so easily manipulated by an effeminate young man. Bai had been standing behind Su's back the whole time, waiting obediently for him to bring him the dropped item. Lan asked Mr. Su what had happened to him. He asked why Su had his hands so absorbed in someone else's handkerchief and wasn't going to let go. Lan remarked that it looked very cute. Su turned around and looked at Bai. He felt ashamed of his actions. Su was drenched in sweat, and yet he couldn't help himself. Finally, he made the only right decision and started to flee. Lan shouted in his wake that Su still had his handkerchief in his hand. Lan was very pleased with himself and his actions. He smiled slyly to himself as he looked at the fleeing Su. After all, his sudden escape meant that Su would return to the training ground not soon. In this way, Lan helped the master avoid unwanted problems. Meanwhile, at the Temple of Heavenly Will, Tao Er's training continued. Master stated that she should focus on the 36 small circles of qi circulation. Yan assured that this method would allow the girl to advance to one of the most important steps. Tao sat in front of him with her head tilted. She was very ashamed of her appearance. The mentor reminded the girl that he had just told her about the principle of the training method, and he wanted to know if Tao Er had memorized everything. The girl didn't care. Her face was burning, and she couldn't make a sound out of embarrassment. Tao was very disturbed by the abbot's behavior. She remembered with shame that her mentor had touched her thighs, gently adjusting her stockings, and now no one would be able to take her as a wife. Yan understood her mood perfectly and smirked, closing his eyes in pleasure. He thought that his foolish student had nothing to be ashamed of. He remembered that he had only helped the girl to adjust her stockings, on which the creases had formed. It was simply impossible to avoid their touch in this process. Justifying his actions, Yan told himself that as a kindred spirit, there was no way in his life he would have allowed himself to think of anything disgusting. After all, he had merely smoothed the folds of her stockings in a friendly manner, and he saw nothing objectionable here. making a serious expression on her face. Yan reminded her of one famous expression that spoke of a mentor becoming a father for life. Embarrassed, Tao admitted that she had heard that expression more than once. Her mentor involuntarily made her blush, and Tao looked forward to the end of the training session. Master informed Tao that they were one family from today, so there was no need to get caught up in the many rules and unnecessary formalities. Yan was glad that Tao finally understood him. He asked Lin and Junhen to step forward and give their sister a visual demonstration. The master could finally take a break. He had been in too much of a hurry and had almost scared the girl away. He could only hope that everything would work itself out in time. Mo Junhen's sword slammed into the concrete base of the training ground with a clang. This noise drew everyone's attention and distracted Tao slightly. Yu Ling and Mo Junhen reported combat readiness in one voice. They were ready to train at any minute. Mentor Yan and Tao moved farther away to the steps going up to the shrine. Lin and Junhen took their place on the platform. They adopted battle stances, exposing their blades. Junhen smirked and said that he hadn't tested the younger disciple's abilities in a long time. Yuling warned his older brother that he should be more careful. Junhen didn't reply anything to Lin and immediately soared into the air, intending to crush his opponent from on high. Yuling immediately followed the example of his older brother disciple and flew up from his seat towards Mo Junheng. The mentor stood smiling and watched the battle of his disciples hovering in the air. Tao stood there with her mouth hanging open. Yu Ling rushed towards his elder brother like a comet and swung his sword at him. He was confident that he would defeat him in this aerial duel. Mo Junhen flew towards his opponent and swung his foot in a leap. On the fly, Mo began to pull out his sword from behind his back, anticipating a quick victory. Tao, who was blushing, looked at the duelists, and suddenly a vague hunch crossed her mind. The girl called out to the guys that their faces looked very familiar, and it was quite likely that they had met Tao before. Looking at them more closely, the girl was convinced that this was the case. Now she remembered these young men. Tao told the senior disciple that he was very much like the gentleman who had once saved her from being chased. As for the third student, Tao recalled that his build seemed quite familiar to her as well. The girl stood and pointed a finger at each of them. Master Yan and his disciples dejectedly lowered their heads. They were not entirely happy about the fact that Tao had recognized and exposed everyone. Tao kept looking at the third disciple thoughtfully. She tried to remember where she could have seen him. This thought kept bothering her. She recalled the events that had happened 6 months ago, and concluded that this man was very similar to the man who had attacked her. Master Yan laughed pretentiously and said that it was just her fantasy. They just looked like those people, and it couldn't have happened. The duel stopped. Yan explained to Tao that these two had not left Huanhai for 30 years. Therefore, there was absolutely no way she could have seen them before. Junhan and Yu Ling immediately realized the consequences and ran away. Tao looked at the young people in surprise and asked her mentor about the reason for their escape. Master Yan turned pale. His disciples had left him to deal with the girl's suspicions, and left him to deal with his own. The mentor said in a stern voice that it was class time and there was no need to be distracted by other things. Tao fell on her knees at the appointed place and agreed with him. In a cautionary tone, Yan demanded to study the technique thoroughly. Tao should start from the very basics and then continue to go deeper. Master Yan was out of his mind. He had somehow miraculously escaped this time as well, but Tao still nearly caught him in a lie. This was getting dangerous. Yan regretfully thought that the danger was still not completely over, and the disciple he had gotten with such difficulty could easily walk away from him. The master was happy to think that the girl was still too naive and believed everything, and when everything was over, he would teach her the wisdom of life. He gazed greedily at the girl's lovely figure, and promised that he would do it so that she could not be fooled by any scoundrel. Suddenly, the master's eyes opened wide. He saw something and realized that he hadn't made a mistake in choosing the girl to be his apprentice. Tao was sitting on her knees, meditating with her eyes closed. At some point, a powerful ice pillar appeared behind her. The girl continued to sit there serenely. Master Yan looked very satisfied. Of course he was, because he had obtained a very capable disciple. This was what was expected of a child chosen by the heavenly Tao. With only her innate talents, she is already able to interact with the powers of Poe's 3 animal souls, and her talent is quite good, even by the master's own standards. Tao sat in front of her mentor with her eyes closed and thought lovingly that Yan was destined for her by fate itself. She vowed to herself that she would officially honor Yan as her master starting today. Tao remembered the large forest with large trees that they passed through on their way to the Temple of Heaven's Will and all the suspicious moments. Despite the incomprehensible, sometimes quite strange behavior of her fellow students, the girl would very much like to get along with all of them in the future. Tao remembered those 2 subjects, Lin and Junhen. They were acting very suspiciously, and the girl was sure that they had made that play. However, one had to keep in mind the most important thing, which was the goal to be achieved. Master Yan could help her with that. Under his guidance, the girl practiced with the sword and realized that she too needed to try hard on the path to her perfection. Several years had passed since that very first day of Tao Er's spiritual development training. Another sunny day had come. Strong gusts of wind fluttered the white sheets hung on a clothesline on the patio. Tao Er was very hard to manage on her own. The girl was already tired, and now she had to work hard on herself. She reproached herself that she had been leading an independent life here for quite some time, but even now she could not wash her own clothes by herself. Tao Er resented her older brother's behavior as well. He had always helped her, but now he just walked away, and she didn't know how to use the soap pods of the Gladikia. Mentor Yan stood at the girl's back and listened to her dissatisfaction. He came up to her and said that he saw Tao Er doing laundry. The girl was startled and dropped everything into the basin. She turned around and saw that it was indeed Yan. The girl was surprised and asked what the purpose of his visit was. The mentor announced that he had come to check on how his capable student was coping with independent living. Tao Er tried to cover her laundry. She begged him not to look and asked why the master was laughing at her, for any success was out of the question. The girl explained that she'd had servants help her with the laundry before, and she was just a little inexperienced at it, that's all. Yan was very surprised. His eyes lit up with a sly fire. The master realized that he had a chance to win the girl back to his side. He immediately threw off his jacket right on the floor. The mentor explained that in addition to spiritual development, he could teach the girl household skills. Smiling, Yan rolled up his sleeves. Tao Er was ready to fall ashamed and asked in surprise if it was okay to do that. The master assured that there is no problem with it. He would show how it was all done, and so he asked the girl to watch carefully and memorize. Yan stuck his hands into the basin of laundry and realized it was a girl's clothes. He was very happy that he could touch the clothes of an unmarried young girl after many years. Yan began to explain to the girl that she should not rub the soap pods on her clothes at once. You should rinse the clothes first and then use the pods. After all, she had just taken off her underwear and was left in one dress and stockings. The girl was very worried and embarrassed. Tao Er was very embarrassed. Her face was burning. She wanted to scream loudly or make it so that no one would remember. She remembered with horror that all her other underwear was also in the basin, and covered her eyes with her hands in shame. Yan pretended not to notice and asked if she remembered everything. Mentor grabbed her underwear that was lying near the basin of laundry and as if casually remarked that it was quite hot today. Yan brought an element of her clothes to his cheek and wiped his face with sweat. The girl was angry and couldn't say a word out of anger. Her mentor winked at her, asked what was wrong, and carelessly took her underwear by the corner. Tao was ready to fall to the ground, tears welling up on her face. Carelessly tossing her underwear aside, Yan explained to the girl in a calm voice that soap alone was not enough here. Tao blushed even more. The girl had a faint hope that the mentor hadn't noticed anything and had mistaken the girl's underwear for rags. Yan nonchalantly told her that the next thing to do was to rub the clothes repeatedly. Tao thought that the master didn't understand and had taken the clothes by mistake. In that case, things could still be fixed. Tao Er watched her mentor for a while. He seemed to be engrossed in the laundry and didn't see anything around him. Then the girl furtively walked around the side of him and crouched down beside her underwear, which the master had tossed aside. Yan paid no attention to Tao, and the girl grabbed her underwear. She hid it behind her back and decided that she couldn't let the master know about this incident. She was very uncomfortable. In addition, the girl was worried about how her mentor could remain so calm. Yan winked at Tao Er. The girl realized that it was now that he was rubbing soap on her most intimate elements of clothing, and flushed like a boiled cancer again. She couldn't believe she was the only girl who cared about such matters. Tao couldn't get rid of her crimson complexion. Yan was making her blush. Looking at her mentor's serene face, the girl realized, to her deepest regret, that she was the only one bothered by the question. But she was mistaken. Yan was perfectly calm on the outside for appearance's sake, but inside, he was jubilant that he was able to get to the most intimate element of the garment. After finishing the laundry, Yan and Tao Er worked together to hang it to dry on the clothesline. Yan said that after working hard, the mood would immediately lift. Tao Er was ready to die of shame. She stared at the ground and could not look at the master. It seemed to her that no one would take her as a wife after that. As if remembering something, Yan said that Tao Er didn't seem to have any business right now. So he asked her to come into his master's spacious room for a while. Tao Er's eyes started to water and she became even more shy. She couldn't understand what exactly the mentor meant. The obscene suggestion came to her mind at once, and now her face was burning with shame. She asked the master in a low voice why she was going to his office. The sun was shining brightly that day. The unusual climate of this place made it possible to observe various atmospheric phenomena with the naked eye. Master Yan and Tao Er were walking through the central plaza right in the center of the courtyard. The girl couldn't understand what the proposal was. The girl followed her mentor without complaint, but she was very nervous. She was worried about the fact that the master had called her to his room out of the blue. Tao Er assumed that Yan would ask her to be his girlfriend. She imagined herself in her mentor's arms on a bed of roses. It was quite obvious to the girl because Master Yan had allowed himself to do things of not quite moral origin towards her. She shook her head furiously, blushing as if to dismiss the thought as wrong. Tao convinced herself it wasn't that at all. After all, Yan is her mentor, and this is most likely a matter related to her training and continued spiritual perfection. Master Yan stood with his back to the girl and looked thoughtfully out the round window. Tao Er thought again that this love could be mutual. The girl blushed again. She was tentative and shy, stomping around in one place. She had not told her mentor why she had come here yet. The master sat down on the couch near the window and patted the seat beside him, motioning for Tao Er to take the seat next to him. The girl was a little startled. An indignant Tao shouted that there was no way she could do that. After all, people usually do such things only after marriage. The girl continued to protest, and the mentor sat there, unable to understand why Tao Er was furious with him. He turned pale and silently waited for the girl to calm down. Master Yan confusedly asked what Tao Er meant now. The mentor didn't intend to cause her any harm, he only wanted to draw a portrait of her. The master's confession made the girl blush. She felt ashamed of her suspicion of him. Tao Er tried not to look her mentor in the eye. To her regret, the girl realized that the master had no intention of offering her anything obscene. He only wanted to paint her portrait. To justify herself, Tao Er immediately became indignant and said that the portrait was also wrong. Yan ran around the room around her, picking up a suitable pose. The girl had already calmed down a bit and was trying to stand still in one place and not fidget. Suddenly she saw something interesting. Right in front of Tao Er, there was a wall gallery of paintings behind the master's back, and the girl on one of them was very similar to Tao herself. The girl immediately rushed to the gallery. She was curious to see what else was depicted there. Yan put the unfinished portrait aside in bewilderment. The first picture showed a napping chick in a nest. One wing was bandaged. Tao said that the chick was very cute. The girl marveled at the striking authenticity and asked if the work was his. The master continued to draw Tao Er from the back and smiled. He said that he wanted to introduce the girl to her older sister co-student. Tao Er was surprised. She couldn't believe that this bird could be her older sister. Yan took out some drawings and showed one of them. He explained that the bird had been injured and had fallen into the grounds of the Temple of Heavenly Will. Showing another picture of a girl in a tree, the preceptor said that this was her appearance in human form. Her name is Yang Yan. They stood in front of the gallery, and Yan told her that the girl was indeed older than Tao Er. They were like a family, and Yan relied on her mentor for a lot of things. At this point, the master's face changed and became very sad. He said that he was very sorry that it had happened like this. Tao Er looked at him in surprise and asked why he felt sorry for that girl. Mentor Yan was a master of understatement. Yan said sadly, "One day someone leaves you, and only then do you realize how happy those days were." Tao Er suddenly realized what the master meant. The girl must have died, and that was why the master spoke about her with such sadness, as if he was grieving for her. She hesitantly assumed that the girl had already gone to the world of immortals. Tao grabbed the master's hand and apologized for asking about it. Yan smiled and hurriedly explained that Tao had misunderstood him. Yan had traveled to a distant land and was not around now. The girl was glad to see this ending to the story. She continued to hold her mentor's hand in her palms. She was genuinely glad that her big sister was okay. When the emotion subsided a little, the girl was surprised to realize that she was holding her mentor's hand in her own. It was unacceptable to her. Her face immediately took on a crimson hue. Tao Er was very ashamed of her emotional behavior. She frowned and looked at the floor, staring at the ceiling to avoid facing the master's gaze. Tao stammered and exclaimed that she was apologizing. Yan smiled and said he didn't see anything wrong. He added that they would meet again in the future. And now his heart is filled with joy at the mere memory of their life together. The girl turned her attention to the next picture with the indignant girl and asked if Master and Yan's relationship was really so marvelous. The mentor smirked and told her that it couldn't have been any other way. After all, Yan trusted Master to the fullest extent. Mentor Yan remembered asking him to raise Yan's already short dress a little higher. He was telling the girl that he would draw a masterpiece, and there was no need to be embarrassed. Yan said that he didn't want to let the girl go when she decided to leave him. In fact, he grabbed Yan's legs and begged her to stay, but she called him a dirty pervert. Master Yan assured Tao Er that he was sad to the point of tears, The girl herself was ready to cry at such a touching story. Now she understood what family meant. Tao was surprised to see that the master was still standing by the gallery, stroking the painting as if trying to breathe life into it. The mentor's thoughts were far away from here. He lamented that he hadn't been able to keep Yan with him. He regretfully thought back to the day they had met for the first time. Their separation had been predetermined beforehand. The master remembered standing on a high cliff and seeing Yan soaring into the sky like a fiery phoenix. He waved goodbye to her. Even the sky itself seemed to have an ominous red-yellow devilish hue, as if mocking the master. Yan remembered his disciple and recalled his words that one day, Yan would spread his majestic wings and ignite a bright flame that would never be extinguished. Then the girl opened one eye and looked at him incredulously. The master added that Yan would then go to the free heights. He closed his eyes and said sadly, all he had to do was protect the temple of heavenly will and watch Yan withdraw far, far away. The master was standing on the edge of a high cliff, and the girl flew up to him, turning into a giant fire phoenix. They looked at each other for a while, and now he was looking at the painting as a memory. The master wanted to believe that Yan was now happily floating in the air in a completely different land. Tao felt that the mentor was actually very sad. She realized that the relationship between the master and her elder sister was deeper than she had thought. The girl looked at her mentor and called out to him excitedly. The master meant much more to her now than a spiritual advisor. Tao felt it. She exclaimed that from now on, Tao wanted to always stay by master's side. The girl could only hope that the master would not reject her. Mentor Yan looked at her perplexedly. He was trying to figure out what caused Tao mood to change so suddenly. After thinking about the situation for a bit and calculating the possible benefits, Yan smirked contentedly. Yan's portraits played into his hands. The master approached Tao and gently, in a fatherly manner, stroked the girl's head. She looked at the teacher fearfully. The mentor looked Tao in the eyes, making eye contact. He realized that he could not miss this chance. Master Yan smiled and said that they seemed to have sorted out the Yan portraits, so it was time for them to continue with the portrait of Tao. The girl had not expected such a quick transition and became embarrassed again. Her indignant cry could be heard even in the courtyard. 3 more days had passed since the visit to the portrait gallery. It was another warm summer day. The sky was almost cloudless. Tao jumped over the steps, walking down quickly. Mentor Yan followed a few steps behind. Bai Lan kept a respectful distance and closed the procession. The girl asked the master why they had only gone to the Divine Gorge for the potions, without the eldest and third apprentice. Master Yan blanched. He remembered well that time on the training ground. The girl had been a little suspicious. Tao guessed even then that they were playing their roles. In the event that Junhen and Lin were near her, she would easily recognize them, and then there would be trouble. The master said that Junhen had recently imbibed the art of sword-wielding, so he would become a hermit for a while. As for Yuling, the mentor didn't want to embarrass his housemate disciple. Lin himself was now sitting in a corner, counting ants out of boredom. Tao perplexedly suggested that it might be because Yuling had once been grabbed and squeezed out all the juices. She even asked her older brother the meaning of those words. Master said that on that day, Yuling had gotten a lot of publicity. Unfortunately, his character had changed a lot after the incident. Mentor Yan enviously said that he actually didn't feel that bad, and the psychological trauma on this background didn't look that big. Bai Lan intervened and told the master that he didn't know anything at all. He explained that there was no need for the young fairies of the 9 heavens to engage in pair cultivation. Lan added that this method is only resorted to by female members of the current who are more than 100 years old and cannot improve further for some reason. Master Yan now saw everything in a different light. He imagined the ancient witch mocking the young man and reproaching him for not trying hard enough. The mentor turned pale. He understood why Yuling didn't want to say a word about those times. Tao couldn't hold back a smile and smirked embarrassedly. The master didn't understand everything about the situation. He asked Bai how Lin managed to escape from the evil sorcerer's environment at all. He immediately pictured little tiny Yuling running away from the evil witch who loomed over him like Gulliver over the Lilliputians. Lan said that the details were unknown. But on the day of Yuling's escape, the head of the 9 heavens fairy current, for an unknown reason, clashed with her daughter, and a commotion ensued. Bai said that the mother scolded her daughter, calling her a slutty wretch, and the daughter berated her mother for her lack of shame. However, Lan said that it could have been the other way around. Master Yan took his head and said that by fate, Yulin had not only gotten into a mess, but had also witnessed a family drama over morals on top of that. With these words, the mentor managed to defuse the situation. Bai Lan and Tao couldn't help but laugh out loud. Master Yan jokingly reprimanded the girl. He sternly rebuked Tao for dabbling, and said that it was wrong to make fun of a fellow student. The 3 of them walked for quite a long time like that, and spent the time on the way with various stories from the past and jokes. By evening, the travelers reached the town of Min. It was very dangerous to continue at night, so Master Yan suggested that they stay and spend the night in the city. Soon they were walking through the evening square of the city, looking at the merchandise. Tao Er saw her favorite candied fruits on a stick and exclaimed that Tanhulu was a great treat for her. The vendor assured her that his product was of the best quality. He invited the girl to look at more, and Tao excitedly rushed to look at a variety of hairpins and combs. There were perfumes here too. Bai Lan told his mentor that he would go and look for an inn. It would be necessary to book rooms in advance. They both looked at the enthusiastic Tao Er. Lan suggested that the master take a stroll through the evening city of Mingyi in the meantime. The mentor was grateful to Lan. This young man immediately understood the atmosphere and casually left him alone with his disciple, thus giving them a date. Master Yan closed his eyes in pleasure. This was just what he needed. The mentor smirked contentedly. It was as if the atmosphere was just right for a stroll. After waiting for Lan to leave, the master called out to Tao Er. She had just sat down at the next counter and was looking at various delicious things. Yan served the girl a portion of tanghulu and said that she was obviously hungry, since he had been looking at that tray so carefully. Tao Er thanked the master fervently. The mentor gave her a hand and asked the girl to stay close to him so as not to get lost. He asked her to stay close to him so that she wouldn't get lost. The girl was instantly embarrassed and began to argue with herself. She was proving to herself that only lovers hold hands, and she shouldn't do it. Her second personality convinced the first that there was nothing wrong if the master asked for it. In this case, principles could be disregarded. They were one family. The second side overcame the first, and the girl hesitantly extended her hand to her mentor. In order not to scare Tao Er away, Yan waited patiently and gently took her hand. The two strolled leisurely through the plaza along the vendors' rows, holding hands. Tao Er was happily eating her candied fruit on a sprig. They were very tasty, and the girl sucked them with pleasure because she had not eaten such a delicacy from her childhood for 100 years. The tanghulu were very sweet, and Tao Er secreted saliva copiously, which remained on the pointed peg and dripped off it onto the ground. It was as if the girl didn't notice it, and embarrassedly suggested to her mentor that she join in and taste the treat as well. Yan also blushed a little and said that he didn't need to beg for a long time since the girl insisted, and Tao Er handed him a tanghula. At this moment, an enthusiastic cheer was heard from outside. Some young man was quite surprised by the coincidence that Lady Su was here. Tao Er looked at the young man more closely. She started to remember and assumed that young Master Luo was standing in front of her. The young man was not alone. He was leading a group of people, all wearing purple outfits. The young man confirmed that his name was indeed Luo Qingping and they had seen each other before she left. Luo smiled, pressed his hand to his chest, and declared that now they had suddenly met again. The young man saw it as a sign of fate. Tao Er smiled and said that it was indeed a funny coincidence. The girl stated that they still had things to do, so they had to go. Luo Qingping suddenly stopped the girl. The young man asked her to take her time. He believed that the sign of fate implied walking together since they had met here. Luo couldn't tear his greedy gaze away from Tao Er's wide neckline, which revealed her breasts rather than hiding them. Qingping lustfully said that the market of Mingyai City wasn't that big, but they could still find quite a few interesting places here. The girl was indignant and told Qingping that she and her companions still had a lot of things that needed to be done. Luo Qingping seemed to have only now noticed that the girl in the square was not alone. He shifted his gaze to his opponent. Luo apologized for his bad manners and sneered that because of the young man's insignificance, he didn't notice him at all. Therefore, Qingping asks to leave them alone. The girl was indignant and shouted to Luo that he had no idea who it was. Master Yan stopped her with a gesture. He didn't need the scandal. He smiled and said that he was walking here with his student. Yan noticed that their meeting with Mr. Luo was indeed not accidental, but predestined by the heavens. Luo Qingping was surprised and assumed that the very abbot of the Temple of Heaven's Will was standing in front of him. He was curious to see him in person. Yan said that it is like this. He is the mentor of Tao Er. Luo Qingping couldn't stand it and laughed loudly. He couldn't help himself after all. This wasn't the kind of encounter he had expected. Luo's entire group started teasing Tao in every way possible. This person didn't even look like a teacher. Neither Tao Er nor Yan reacted to the provocations. Luo Qingping walked closer to the master, almost in close proximity, and gazed intently into his face. He stated that Yan seemed suspicious to him. He was full of hidden secret intentions. The mentor only smiled in response to his angry outbursts, and Luo blurted out that the master was definitely hatching some bad plans. Master Yan continued to hold on. He knew that he couldn't afford to interrupt his date with the beautiful Tao Er just because of a couple of annoying gnats. The mentor discreetly glanced in the girl's direction. He mentally begged her not to pay any attention to the group of envious fools. Qingping continued to persuade the girl. He assured her that Yan was just fooling her, but at the same time, Luo himself guaranteed Tao personalized training at the Luoqing school. Tao indignantly told Luo that every disciple, even after completing their training, becomes them forever, so she asked them not to be disturbed. Master Yan paternally placed his hand on her head. He smirked and covered his eyes in pleasure. He knew that this sentence alone was already enough. Tao Er was on his side. The mentor smiled proudly and stared at Luo Qingping with a victorious gaze. The battle had been lost, and he had to retreat. Master Yan slyly opened one eye and snidely asked Luo Qingping if Luo Qingping had any other questions for him. But Luo felt far superior to his opponent, so he wasn't going to give in to him at all. He turned pale and said that Yan must have deigned to make a joke. His mentor replied to him that Qingping looked like a human but acted like a dog, and he wasn't going to listen to that. Moreover, Luo only exacerbated their conflict. Qingping was completely enraged. He couldn't say anything out of anger and only poked and prodded helplessly and tried to threaten the master. The mentor smirked and said that Qingping simply couldn't accept that she had such a soulful relationship with her master. Luo Qingping realized his blunder too late and exclaimed that it wasn't like that at all, and they had just misunderstood him. That was enough for Tao, and she turned away proudly. Yan admonished, stating that he was Tao Er's mentor. In status, it was equal to his elders. Even more so, his disrespectful behavior equated to an insult. Master Yan friendly agreed to give Luo one last chance. If Qingping left through the dog loophole in the city gate, he wouldn't make any claims. This infuriated the young man, and he declared that he was the eldest son of the master of the Luoqing school. No one dared to insult him. The members of his group didn't seem to mind swinging their fists. Luo Qingping saw something he really didn't like. He turned pale with anger and started spitting saliva. Yan didn't react to anything at all. He only placed his palm on the embarrassed girl's head and declared that he was Tao Er's mentor. He turned to the girl, winked cheerfully at her, and said that the master was very pleased with the honor of being mentored by the beautiful Tao Er. The girl nodded happily. She said in response, Tao Er was even more excited to be Grandmaster Yan's disciple. Luo Qingping couldn't stand it. He was beyond angry. Suddenly, Mentor Yan saw someone new, and he turned his attention to the man. The man approached Qingping's group. That man was also wearing purple clothes. He laughed and said that Abbot Z had a pretty good tongue. He was satisfied. The man took off his hood and introduced himself as Feng Shanfeng, the patron of Luoqing School. He suggested that they become friends since they had met today. Feng said he still does not know the location of the so-called Temple of Heavenly Will and its size. The number of the mentor's disciples also remains a mystery. Tao Er hid behind the master's back and looked out fearfully from there. He joked that he didn't have many students. 1, 2, and a few. Shanfeng assured him that they had at least 1,000 ascetics and hundreds of thousands of servants from the common people who worshipped them. The mentor was very surprised by such an imposing figure. Tao Er was even more surprised. Hundreds of thousands of acolytes simply did not invest in her imagination. Feng assured the girl that those ordinary people lived in peace and tranquility under the protection of their warriors. So it was perfectly normal to charge them tribute. The girl was indignant. After all, the imperial court already imposes exorbitant taxes on its people, which not everyone manages to pay. Tao Er exclaimed that after all that, it was simply not nice or fair to demand any more offerings from those people. Feng explained to the girl that without the protection of his men, many different troubles could happen to their belongings, which is why they accept gifts from peasants. Tao shouted that it was their school's fault that people went to such lengths. She was sure that the peasants were just forced. The girl shouted that Feng was a shameless person. Shanfan exclaimed that she just didn't understand anything. To maintain a current of several thousand people, it wasn't enough for them to just hunt through the forests and grow vegetables. The girl ran out of arguments and couldn't say a word out of anger. The mentor told Tao Er that it was not worth bickering with cowardly people. He would settle the matter himself. Yan was angry with himself. To think that he had wasted so much time on this horde of insects. Even a few tens of thousands of years hadn't taught him anything. Considering they had nearly brought his precious student to tears, it was time to put a bold end to this conversation and teach them a little lesson. At the same moment, someone tugged at his clothes from behind. He heard someone call him Master. Master Yan turned around and saw Bai Lan. He had a thin veil of white light cloth over his face. It made him look more like a girl. Bai Lan imperiously hooked his elbow on the master's elbow and dragged him away. He said that he and his apprentice had had enough of loitering around the city without doing anything. With his other hand, he grabbed Tao Er and explained that they should return to the inn and rest as soon as possible. Bai said that they would go to the Divine Gorge tomorrow as it was too late today. Luo Qingping couldn't stand it and shouted after the trio to stop immediately. He was already ready to catch up with them. Suddenly, he felt someone put their hand heavily on his shoulder. Master Luoqin's son turned around unhappily. As it turned out, it was Feng. He explained to the young man that he shouldn't worry so much about nothing. The young man looked at his mentor with a puzzled look. Shanfen clarified that he should have listened better, for those three had said they would go to Divine Gorge tomorrow. Divine Gorge was a narrowing mountain canyon with a rather narrow stream running below it. If you wanted to, you could jump over it. Bailan and Tao Er were hunting for a strange creature with human legs and the body of a fish. The creature had a full tail and fins, and Tao wasn't sure if it could be eaten. But in the evening, the girl quickly changed her mind. The captured creature was slowly roasting on a spit in its own juice. When the dish was served, Tao Er drooled at the fragrant smell of the food. The girl exclaimed that the dish smelled delicious. The girl was fascinated by Bai's cooking skills and asked if she could learn to cook as good. Yan thought that the local wildlife was very good. Master Yan smiled and thought that Lan's spatial bag really did contain anything. He redefined the concept of surviving by any means necessary. Suddenly, the mentor discovered something not quite right for their setting. He frowned and took a closer look. Yan couldn't believe his eyes. Despite his categorical prohibition, Bailan had still taken a few sets of women's clothes with him on the hike. Bailan was just doing the cooking at this moment and didn't see anything. Tao Er stood nearby and questioned him. Yan asked Bai to come over to him. Master Yan unceremoniously turned Lan's female clothes out of the spatial bag. Bai sat on his lap and obediently bowed his head. The mentor was out of his mind. Bai had rarely seen him so angry. Yan shouted that Lan shouldn't have women's clothes, and he had warned the young man about that when he had taken him on the trek. Bailan immediately began to justify that there was nothing wrong with that. After all, he had just brought these clothes with him, but he had no intention of wearing them at all. The mentor folded all these women's clothes into one bundle and handed them to Bai. He wanted the disciple to throw them away himself. Lan looked at him with a pleading look. He cursed himself for not listening to the master. He asked for permission to keep at least 1 or 2 sets of clothes. Lan asked for permission to keep at least 1 or 2 sets of clothes. But the mentor was relentless. He frowned at his disciple, and Bailan realized that he wouldn't get away with persuasion. At the same moment, Master Yan simply turned around and threw the bundle of Bai's female clothes away. Lan helplessly stared back at him. The mentor threatened to flog him right in front of his fellow sister if such a thing happened again, and Bailan dejectedly bowed to him. The master and his apprentice came to the fire where Tao Er was working. She wanted to ask her mentor what they were doing, but her mouth was full of food, so she couldn't make any sense out of it. Yan said that nothing special had happened. It was time for them to move on their way. Tao exclaimed that they hadn't eaten anything, and everything was so delicious. In fact, there was nothing to eat anymore. Soon they continued on their way through the Divine Gorge. The gorge became deeper and deeper, and Mentor Yan said that this was the abyss of the Divine Gorge. The gorge ended in a high cliff. In several places, streams of mountain water were noisily running down. There was absolutely nothing to be seen below. To get a better look around, Tao Er squatted down by the cliff. She said with admiration that this pit was very big. Yan looked closely at the terrain. Suddenly he noticed a large flower growing straight out of the rock. In spite of the strong flow of water, the bright red flower held firmly to its stem. Master Yan was satisfied. They had found what they came here for. The mentor exclaimed happily that they had found a flower of water and fire. The flower was indeed like a flame. Bailan called Bailan over to him and silently pointed to a flower blazing with fire in the mountain waters. The young man immediately rushed to carry out the order. Bailan ran as fast as he could. He was ashamed of himself for disobeying instructions. The young man raced towards the cliff, leaving only a puff of dust behind him. At the very last moment, Bailan pushed off and soared into the air, leaving behind the surprised and frightened Tao Er. The mentor watched calmly. Bailan clearly calculated his jump and spun down onto the mountain stream, landing carefully near the flower itself so as not to damage it. The young man leaned over to the fiery flower and gently pulled its stem. He had to pick it correctly, or there would be no new ones. Bailan proudly displayed his flower, raising it upwards. Tao Er expressed her delight by raising both her hands up. Only Mentor Yan did not react. He stood still as he did. The master told Bai to get up quickly, for they were waiting for him. He couldn't forgive Lan Yu's prank with women's clothes. Suddenly a voice was heard from behind. Luo Qingping curtly said hello to Tao Er. Naturally, he was not by himself, and had brought the fighters in the Divine Gorge with him. Lo said happily that they had met again. He was already anticipating the pleasure, and was ready to teach his teacher a little lesson. Tao Er opened her eyes wide with fear. This old acquaintance frightened her very much. The mentor, on the other hand, didn't seem surprised in the least. You could tell by the look on his face that he was even glad to have this meeting far away from the city, where no one would save the hooligans. Bailan winked cheerfully at his master. He knew that this master's smirk wouldn't do any good for the uninvited guests. Luo Qingping was glad that he had managed to catch the girl and her companions off guard. He was advancing on the travelers with 5 of his fighters. Bailan had just jumped out of the gorge instead of the flower and was watching them. He even felt a little sorry for the impudent men who didn't realize who they were messing with. Qingping stepped forward. Smiling excitedly, he declared that here they were, meeting again. The superiority was on his side, and Luo knew it. Master Yan smirked back and said with surprise that it was just that guy whose name he couldn't even recall due to his inconspicuousness. Mentor smiled and said that it was a very pleasant coincidence for him, and he was genuinely happy about their chance meeting. Luo asked him to stop braying and just give them the flower of water and fire if Yan understood what was really going on. Shanfan cut him short and wondered where his manners had gone. After all, there was absolutely no reason for the young man to make threats. Luo turned around in surprise. Shanfan told the master that they had come here for that flower. He offered to buy the flower of water and fire from the master. Shangfan added that he would put a fair price on that flower. He pretended to think about it and laughed merrily, saying that the flower was worth 3 of their lives. Tao Er was startled and hid behind her mentor's back. Master Yan smirked and said that such a price seemed really fair to him. The mentor frowned, his face immediately becoming serious. He stared at the smiling Shanfang, who was mentally celebrating his victory. The mentor's eyes lit up with an ominous red light. Snapping his fingers, Master Yan smirked and asked Shanfang if he was sure they could afford such a price. Shangfang scratched his beard with a smile. Luo shouted happily that Feng Shangfang's patron is a supreme master of the Luo King School, and he would swat them with 1 palm. Master Yan marveled that Shangfang was so good at martial arts. In his heart, he called him an idiot because he had specifically told him where he was going. The mentor smiled and asked Bai to give those unfortunate people the flower. Bai Lan happily agreed and encased the flower in a large protective sphere. He threw the orb towards Qingping as if it was something insignificant. As it flew out of his hands, the sphere gained speed. Feng Shangfang deftly caught it with his hand and smirked happily. They had the flower, and now the enemy could be dealt with. Luo understood this as well. He stood beside him and smiled. Tao Er was surprised. She couldn't understand how a master could just cowardly take the hard-won water and fire flower and give it away. Mentor Yan said that he had fulfilled his obligation and they had received the flower of water and fire. He asked if they could go. Luo Qingping smiled gloatingly and said that they never settled last time. Therefore, Master would not be able to leave here alive. Tao Er indignantly said that he promised to let them go if he got the flower. Luo smiled and stated that it was Mentor Feng who said that. It had nothing to do with him. Qingping smiled lustfully and said that he wanted to ask Lady Su again if she would like to be his personal disciple. His companions were clearly surprised by Tao's indecision. The girl exclaimed that Tao should be glad that Luo had his eye on her. Tao Er stood firmly and paid no attention to their remarks. Then the other students joined in the conversation. They said that Tao Er should have shown gratitude, but instead she's being trashy and insolent. Luo Qingping shouted that Tao Er simply has no choice and should not cling to her master. But if the girl agrees, Luo is willing to give her mentor's life. The girl heard the master's quiet voice beside her. He called her name in a steady voice. Tao turned around. She seemed embarrassed. Mentor Yan asked Tao if she now realized what those people were. The girl stood and looked at the master. Yan explained to her that even if she agreed, they still wouldn't keep their word. This group had planned to kill them from the beginning. They just wanted the flower of water and fire. The mentor asked Tao Er to remember firmly that not a word of cowardly people should be trusted. They are very treacherous. Now Tao Er understood everything. Yan had revealed the cruel truth to her. The girl exclaimed that it was clear to her and hugged her mentor's arm with both hands. Tao Er urged Luo Qingping to finally give up and give up on her. She reminded him that the one who becomes a mentor remains a master for the disciple for life. Blushing, Tao Er exclaimed that her master was a particularly important person to her, and so she would never leave him. Master Yan was ready to burst into tears as he listened to the pleasant speech about himself. He was very touched by the girl's feelings for him. Yan recognized that those types were very useful to him in amorous matters. However, he was getting tired of this comedy. He decided that it was time to teach these people who called themselves the Loxin School a lesson. But Luo Qingping wasn't going to deal with them right away. He had another trump card up his sleeve. Luo slyly called out to the master. He raised high above his head and showed everyone the ill-fated bundle of women's clothes. Luo asked his mentor if he recognized the bundle. Master Yan flinched in surprise. He had expected anything but that Bai's bag would end up in the possession of those crooks. Luo continued to press on and assumed that the veiled disciple's belongings were in there. When Luo unwrapped the bundle, he acted surprised and asked what the woman's clothes were doing there. Master Yan realized that the matter had taken a very unpleasant turn and turned pale. However, Bailan himself was smiling as if it didn't concern him. Qingping turned the roll over and asked Tao to take a look. It turned out that one man liked to wear womanizing clothes, and Luo was curious about which one it was. Luo couldn't calm down anymore and hyped them up further. He assumed that both Yan and Bai had an unconventional orientation. As soon as he had only said this phrase, the next offensive word stuck and remained unspoken. A powerful punch to the jaw stopped Qingping. Bailan gave him blow after blow without any apparent effort. It was as if he wasn't fighting, but rather amusing himself with his opponent. Bai hit Luo's bully with such force that he flew back to his fellow students. He lost several teeth along the way. Seeing this scene, his companions were frightened. They had not expected such a rebuff. Only now did the disciples of the Luo King School begin to see the Heavenly Will Temple's master as an opponent. Even Feng had to admit that the blow had been struck too quickly. He was beginning to realize that his opponent was not an easy one. Bailan fixed his hair and smirked. He liked the fact that his opponents were scared to death. Now it was possible to play on. Bai asked the opponents around him why they thought it was wrong for a man to wear such clothes. Bailan began to slowly pull off his clothes. Master Yan demanded that they stop. Tao was finally embarrassed and exclaimed that they were in the open air. Finding himself without clothes, Lan asked the people around him if it was so important that he was a man, as long as the clothes fit him. Luo and Feng looked at the naked young man confusedly. Bailan bent down to pick up the clothes and perform some manipulations on them. No one really understood what really happened. The next moment, Bailan was already standing dressed once again. This time he was wearing a white and blue robe mottled with blue flowers. Lan appeared in his new dress and stockings and asked if the world would collapse if he wore such clothes. Feng turned pale. He now recognized the young man. He shouted fearfully that Bai wasn't dead then and all those stories were true. At one time, Lan was attacked by 3 great masters. But at the last moment, the great sword spirit intervened and scattered his opponents like children. Luo Qingping angrily asked who it was. Shanfeng explained that this monster knew no barriers, and there was no evil he wouldn't do. Because of him, the cultivation world had changed. Ironically, Bai severed Feng's head just as he was swearing that for all of Lan's atrocities, he would not take his head off. The head of the mentor, with glazed eyes, drenched in blood, slowly rolled towards his students. After realizing what had happened, Luo Qingping shouted in a low voice. He jumped backwards and fell on his back in surprise and started to stagger backwards. Bai Lan touched his fingers, on which blood splattered to his face. He touched his bloody fingers to his lips. The young man smiled and seemed to give Qingping an air kiss with his fingers that had drops of blood on them. He gave the young man a hint of what was in store for him. Bai Lan handled the sword as easily and effortlessly as if he was dancing. After spinning around with the blade for a while, he spread his arms to different directions and stood with his back to his opponents. Lan was very satisfied. It had been a long time since he had felt this way. Nothing could give him as much satisfaction as the joy of battle. Meanwhile, Mentor Feng's severed head bounced off the ground and ended up at Loxin's feet. His companions were scared to death. The same thought was running through each of their minds. It was simply inconceivable that a supreme master had been struck down with a single blow. Without a moment's hesitation, all the disciples present, except Qingping, turned around and rushed to run away. Luo urged them to stop and promised a generous reward for Bai's head. No reward was needed for his daredevils, and they scattered in different directions. Lo begged to be saved. He was hurt that everyone had turned their backs on him, the master's eldest son. Bailan smirked. The situation was now entirely under his control. He would avenge all the wrong words and actions very soon. Bai whirled past the stunned Luo Qingping. Lan wasn't interested in this man right now. He was still cowardly and wouldn't go anywhere. Lan easily caught up with the fleeing enemies and picked his first target. As he rushed towards him, Bai interrupted his short life. Having finished his business, the young man turned around in the other direction, smiling happily. On the way, he flipped off another opponent. Soaring into the air, Bailan calmed down another particularly insolent opponent and silenced him for good. Even Master Yan himself couldn't look at it calmly. He turned Tao around to face him, hugged her, and asked her not to look, listen, or remember any of it. Luo Qingping yelled like a scalded man. He realized that sooner or later it would be his turn. Luo was overcome with panic and fear of death, and he cried and begged for forgiveness. But Bailan did not respond to his pleas and inexorably approached the young man. Qingping collapsed his head on the ground and remained like that. Bailan immediately stepped on his hand with the heel of his boot, and Qingping squealed like an uncut piglet. Without letting go of his hand, Bai said that now it was Luo Qingping's turn. The young man pleaded and shouted that Lan couldn't kill him so easily. Qingping began to threaten that if he died, the Luo King School would use all its strength to avenge him. The girl, the last of Qinping's group, also heard this conversation. She realized that she would not be spared either, and so she began to think feverishly about how she could get out of this dangerous situation. A rather interesting thought occurred to the girl. This option had many gaps, but there was nothing better in store anyway. The girl rightly thought she had better take her chances in this situation, and she ran at full speed towards Bai, pulling her sword from its sheath as she went. Bai Lan was just a bit busy and was teaching Qinping wisdom. One shouldn't insult people he didn't know for no reason. Seeing the rushing girl with a naked sword, Lan smiled. All these opponents had left the world too fast and boring. He was hoping to stretch himself a bit. Before she reached him, the girl swung her sword at the recent leader of her group. She hoped to buy her life with a sneak attack. The girl began cursing Luo and revealed that she had endured insults and offenses for 16 whole years. She added that Qinping was a morally depraved person. She assured that in the future, the younger sister would definitely thank the elder sister. For Lan's sake, she was ready to make any sacrifice and endure thousands of deaths. Bai looked at the girl carefully and said that Sis was apparently very serious. The girl was already beginning to believe in her salvation. Bai Lan informed her that it was not at all necessary to endure 1,000 deaths. His eyes lit up with the greedy, devilish fire of reprisal. The young man swung his sword and the girl's breathless body fell at his feet. Tao Er finally turned around and looked at the scene of carnage. Bai Lan stood with his back to them, holding a bloody sword, and told his last victim that one death was enough for him. When it was over, Master Yan called Lan over to him and said that he had always been curious about one question. Bai looked at his mentor in surprise. Yan said that he was burning with curiosity because he didn't know where Bai Lan usually hid his sword. Bai Lan smirked and said that the master had a very corrupted imagination and thought too badly of his disciple. A blush played on Bai's cheeks. He asked if Master Yan really wanted to know, and began to slowly lift the hem of his dress. Yan immediately turned away and demanded that the young man stop immediately. He assured Bai that he understood, and that was enough for him. In fact, when wearing men's clothing, a silver flexible sword was tied around his waist. Yan imagined a disciple wearing such attire. The mentor turned the sobbing girl's back to Lan and explained that normally this type was quite normal, but when dressed as a woman, he would break out into bad behavior. Lan told his mentor to call things by their proper names, since he had a pretty good figure. Tao was surprised. Yan became furious and asked Bai to shut up. Lan continued to give away the master's secrets, and revealed that the master often talks about how sad and lonely he is, but still doesn't want to get close to Lan. Tao Er intervened and asked Bai to change his clothes quickly so as not to anger his mentor. Tao Er intervened and asked Bai to change his clothes so as not to anger his mentor. Lan said that the master constantly pestered him with talk about how much he wanted a girl apprentice. He said that the mentor clearly longed to meet Tao Er all the time. Master Yan frowned unhappily. Staring at Tao Er's large cleavage, Bai Lan said that he was losing to the girl in this aspect as well. Tao took his hint and became embarrassed. Master Yan couldn't bear it anymore and rushed towards his disciple with a bullet. He grabbed him by the waist and pulled him away from Tao Er. Mentor pulled up the hem of Bayu's clothes, laid him on his lap, and began to spank his sternum in a fatherly, hearty manner. After the first blow, Bai Lan turned red with pain and resentment. He felt that he didn't deserve such a punishment, especially since he had just saved everyone from being massacred. Through tears, Bai Lan began to shout that his mentor was just a scoundrel and was treating him unfairly. Lan didn't deserve this. This made the master even angrier. He was unhappy that the guilty disciple was arguing with him and proving his point. Tao Er came running and wanted to intercede for him. Master Yan explained to the girl that there was something she didn't know. He told her that if Lan were to dress up as a woman, she would be in trouble. A couple decades ago, Bai Lan came down from the mountains. That day, the whole world turned into a bloodbath. No one could fight him, everyone died. Everything around was ablaze with red light, and brother was rushing at brother. The country had not seen such battles for a long time. It even came to the point that the main mentors of the three great currents gave their all to hound the young man. Tens of thousands of elite guardsmen and cavalrymen closed the ring and drove the young man into a stalemate. But they failed too. Luckily for him, Mo Junheng arrived in time and pulled him out of the deadly predicament. He picked Lan up and carried him upwards. The warriors were left with nothing. All they could do was shake the air with curses and empty threats. The stream with the fugitives was already far away. Master Yan said that otherwise those three old men would have captured the young man and used him for elixirs. Tao didn't understand everything he said, but she thought he was the best. Bai Lan changed into his usual attire and embarrassedly began to complain that his upbringing had left him all swollen. The mentor became angry. He thought that Bai Lan was trying to make him angry. Master Yan ordered the young man to immediately apologize to his sister apprentice. Bai immediately walked over to Tao and asked him not to take what he said to heart. Tao assured him that there was nothing wrong with it, especially since it was all business. The preceptor ordered Bai to bury those people and take the flower of water and fire. Immediately afterward, let him follow them. Bai Lan obediently turned around in the other direction and leisurely wandered to fulfill his mentor's orders. He knew that his emotions would pass anyway, and everything would be fine. Master Yan led the girl to that very cliff, and Tao asked why they were going back. The master replied that there was a magical barrier at the bottom. It would be good to inspect it. Tao looked fearfully into the dark abyss and pitifully confessed to her mentor that she still hadn't learned how to control the air currents. Master Yan smiled. It was even easier this way. You wouldn't have to keep an eye on the girl. You could just move her downstairs. The mentor smiled affectionately at the student and gave her a hand. He said he didn't see a problem with that. Tao just needed to hold on tight to her master. The girl blushed at the mere thought of having to snuggle up to her mentor. Lan was envious of her at this moment. He too wanted Master Yan to hug him tightly. Meanwhile, the mentor, as if by accident, grasped the girl's breasts firmly, slid down them, and lowered to her waist. With his other hand, the master wrapped his other arm around Tao-er's legs and intercepted higher, resting his fingers on the girl's thigh. After checking if Tao-er was holding on securely, Mentor Yan smirked and began to climb down. The girl's breath was breathtaking, and she screamed the entire time they were descending. Bai Lan soon finished his job of burying the enemy bodies and took off into free flight, catching up with the master and Tao-er. It turned out that the dark abyss at the very bottom was not dark. There was a body of clear, transparent water down there. Tao-er had known for a long time that this place was called the Illusory Sea. Master Yan was surprised that it still hadn't dried up to the bottom. The girl felt good and calm in the master's arms. She was embarrassed to realize that she felt safe around this man. Upon reaching the water level, Mentor Yan cheerfully offered to take a dip and explore what surprises awaited them underwater. They activated the protective spheres at the same time as Bai and submerged themselves underwater with a powerful surge already in the waterproof spheres. At the bottom of the sea, the travelers found an abandoned royal palace. Time had spared it, and the interior could be explored. The underwater travelers carefully surveyed the entire perimeter of the formerly regal luxury from the outside and swam to the roof of one of the structures. Yan saw that there was a breach in one of the walls of the building. When he swam inside, he paid attention to the inscribed letters, but he still couldn't make out anything. Diving into the opening, Bai Lan surfaced out of the water and suddenly discovered that things were somehow different here. The underwater palace inside was not flooded at all and could be walked on. Master Yan explained to his disciple that it was all because of the watertight barrier here. He assured Bai that it would be much easier from here on. Bai Lan was here for the first time and looked at everything with interest. In one of the galleries, he saw signs of a massacre. Many skeletons were lying on the floor with swords in their hands. The girl noticed it too and suggested that a fierce battle had once taken place in this place. Mentor Yan replied that he did. However, he himself finds it difficult to say how long ago this event took place. Tao continued to look at everything and drew the companion's attention to the giant ceilings. She said that the castle was not built for ordinary people, judging by the spans. Soon even the foreman was surprised, and he wasn't the only one. All three travelers were stunned to see one of the inhabitants of the palace. A giant of unbelievable size was sitting under the wall in the lotus posture. Even in this position, he was almost touching the ceiling of the palace. The giant's feet were at least 4 meters wide. The mentor remarked that even for him, the existence of gods in this world was news. Tao didn't quite understand him and thought that Yan was talking about people who had achieved semi-divinity. Bai Lan told the girl that she was deluded. He told her that an ordinary person on the path of perfection could stand on one of the 7 stages. After drawing the diagram and explaining in detail, Bai drew her attention to the fact that the term semi-divinity still had the character for human. Lan looked at the huge skeleton of a knight and began to talk about who those remains could belong to. Master Yan interrupted him and gave his opinion. He said that in his lifetime, that warrior was a true god. He started to reach out his hand to the knight, but something halfway there stopped him. He clenched his hand into a fist, held it briefly, and dropped it without touching the warrior. The giant in knight's armor remained seated with his head bowed forever. It was as if he symbolized the end of his era. Master Yan turned around and walked further. He suggested that they continue on their way and explore the depths of the palace. Tao-er was completely confused. Until now, she had thought that demigodhood was the highest point of development. Now she began to suspect that there was something higher. Suddenly, Mentor Yan saw something unusual. He was surprised and came even closer, but more slowly. For a while, the master observed the object. At first, Yan thought he was mistaken, but then he realized that this was the magic barrier. He ordered his companions to stop where they were. Bai Lan stopped and took a closer look. He turned pale. What the master was pointing out was something he was well aware of. The magic barrier was also known as the spirit sword barrier. It securely blocked the way forward. The magical barrier itself was a protective circle, the entire space behind which was occupied by a multitude of blades hanging in the air, aimed directly at the entrance. Mentor looked around. There seemed to be no way around it. Many men had died here trying to break through the defenses. Master Yan asked Bai to see if there was a weakness in this barrier. He asked Lan to back off immediately if he suspected anything. Bai Lan immediately reached out with his hand for the flexible silver sword that was twisted on his belt. After straightening his sword and making a couple lunges into the air, Lan smiled and reported to his mentor that his apprentice had accepted the order. Bai Lan took a few more steps, and small pebbles immediately began to fall threateningly from the ceiling. But Bai was not intimidated by this. Bai Lan approached the holographic magic barrier, from which blades protruded threateningly. The young man frowned. He realized that this wasn't going to be easy and turned pale. Bai Lan stared at the barrier, unsuccessfully trying to find a weak spot. As the young man advanced, the barrier became clearer. It vibrated threateningly and began to unleash its swords at Lan. At first, the young man was able to successfully repel all the attacks. All of the barrier's defensive blades collided with his sword and flew back, but there were more and more of them. Bayu found them harder to handle, and at one moment he realized with horror that he had missed one of them. The sword that flew out of the protective barrier sank straight into Tao's body, illuminating everything around with yellow light. The girl screamed in pain and surprise. Master Yan was angry and decided that they would definitely break the barrier now. He fended off all the attacks of the defensive blades. The frightened girl stood behind her mentor's back. She peered cautiously over her shoulder, and an exasperated Yan asked Tao Er to be more careful. He demanded to wrap his arms around him from behind and not be distracted. The girl immediately pressed herself tighter against her master and reported that his command had been fulfilled. She really felt cozy behind her master's back. The master trembled with delight. He loved these touches of the girl on his back. Master couldn't help himself and blissed out. Meanwhile, the protective barrier was releasing blades faster and faster, and it was already hard for Lan to dodge and fend them all off. Seeing the approaching threat, the mentor exclaimed that he was unable to protect Tao. He asked him to hurry up and wrap his legs around him. The girl blushed. She had already pressed herself as tightly as she could against the master. Tao was ashamed to even think about it, but the fear of danger was far greater than her embarrassment. Closing her eyes, she still embarrassedly jumped on her mentor's back, wrapping her arms and legs around him. Master Yan immediately pictured a confused koala climbing up a tree trunk, and said that Tao reminded him of this outlandish animal. Bai Lan was distracted for a moment and looked at how Master Yan was deflecting the attacks. Suddenly, he saw that he himself was in danger. Bai thought with annoyance that he was in a fierce battle and couldn't afford to be distracted even for a moment. Dodging the enemy blades spinning and twisting in the air, Bai Lan soared upwards, hoping that they wouldn't get him there. In the next moment, Lan realized that he had made a mistake and there was no way he could dodge in the air. Immediately, he made a decision. If it was impossible to dodge the attack, the only thing to do was to accelerate and fly straight ahead. It was a risky move, but there were no other options. At full speed, Bai Lan rushed towards the barrier, bypassing all the blade attacks. He was rushing too fast, and the barrier didn't have time to attack him. Bai Lan crashed into the barrier with all his might and slammed his sword into its clever weave of blades. It seemed like he had almost succeeded. Still, Bai Lan missed one or two blades and grudgingly wrinkled his nose. He realized that he wouldn't be able to overpower the protective barrier. Tao Er pressed herself against the master's back with fear. The blades flew in the air more and more violently, and everything inside her trembled with terror. But the mentor didn't pay any attention to it. He calmly fluttered among the blades like a moth, and Tao did not suffer any damage. Finally, the master landed and gently lowered the scared-to-death Tao down. The girl reluctantly let go of his back. She was still scared. Master Yan smiled and informed the trembling girl that the danger had passed. They left the affected area. Bai Lan obediently bowed his head and admitted to the master that his disciple's strength wasn't enough. He had only managed to pierce through one layer. The mentor smiled and replied that he was not yet up to the level of swordsmanship of his senior apprentice. It was not a bad result for a mortal. Master Yan explained that this protective barrier had been left by the gods after all, and Bai Lan had performed admirably. The mentor turned to Tao and reminded her that he had started teaching her the swordsmanship techniques of the 12-year cycle, and they had begun to go through the Azure Dragon cycle. Master Yan estimated that the girl should have mastered 3 styles out of the 36 styles in the cycle, and promised to give a demonstration. He unsheathed his sword and held it in front of him, pointing it upwards. The sword vibrated almost immediately, and a golden aura appeared around it. With a quick movement, The master raised the sword upwards, and a fiery image of it appeared in the air, magnified 10 times. Bailan smiled. He had seen this many times before. Tao gasped in delight. She had only heard of the origin spirit phantom before, but she had never seen it. The girl was amazed by the master's strength. She assumed that at the current moment, Mentor Yan was already at the level of semi-divinity. Meanwhile, the master concentrated his power and created a whirl of the barrier blades, making them spin. He thrust his sword upward with a powerful lunge and held the barrier's protective blades at a safe distance. Suddenly, Master Yan pointed his sword at the barrier itself, urging it to break. The full force of the barrier's blades collapsed onto its protective layer. Hundreds of blades flew across the gallery, forming one. Now it was like a fiery comet hurtling toward the barrier. Slamming into the barrier, the blades created a small crack. The barrier began to crack at the seams. The blades continued to fly and strike it. Finally, there was no trace of the barrier left. Tao exclaimed in delight that the master had succeeded. Her eyes were beaming with happiness. The passageway was indeed clear. Dust was slowly settling from the walls and ceiling. There was no trace of the magical barrier and protective blades. Entering the hard-to-open passageway, Master Yan turned pale. Now he understood why this room was so securely guarded against intrusion. The magic barrier had been destroyed, and it was now possible to enter the next room. Mentor Yan stepped over the threshold and was very surprised. The room was guarded very securely even by his standards, and Yan shared his hunches with Tao. The girl was impressed. The master saw nothing special. At the very end of the room there was a platform with steps leading up to it. On the platform was a brown sarcophagus. When the trio of travelers came closer, Master Yan exclaimed that he would never have thought of using so much strength to protect a single coffin in his life. Master Yan walked closer, looking at the huge columns decorated with fancy bas-reliefs with interest. He began to climb the steps. Mentor and Bailan carefully slid the massive lid of the sarcophagus and set it on the floor. Looking inside the coffin, they were both surprised. Tao had one eye peeking out from behind Yan's back. In the sarcophagus was a girl in a purple outfit. Time had not touched the girl or her clothes. It seemed that inside this room, time had stopped forever. Tao tugged the master's shoulder fearfully. She felt like the girl would jump out and attack them. Mentor said there was nothing to worry about. It was just a scarlet corpse. Nevertheless, the master looked at the girl very carefully. He was embarrassed by the fact that he had not yet been able to determine the cause of her death. Bailan noticed that there was nothing here but the girl's coffin. He offered to take the girl with him. The master appreciated his joke and advised Bai to go and explore the other corners in this strange room. Bailan immediately left to explore the room. Tao felt pity for the unknown girl and said that taking her away wasn't such a bad idea. The mentor explained that they didn't know the true situation. Master Yan and Tao approached the open sarcophagus. Now the mentor was not disturbed by their remarks, and he looked more closely at the coffin with the body. His careful inspection was not done in vain. Already in a few minutes the master saw something, and it surprised him a little. On the left side of the girl's body were baby diapers. They were folded in such a way as if they still contained a baby. The mentor reached out perplexedly, not believing his eyes. As far as he could remember, they had never noticed the remains of children's bodies in any room before. Bailan waved his hand at the master and exclaimed that he had managed to find the secret room. The young man stood at the entrance to the room. One door leaf was ajar. The master went to the door and saw that Lan was hesitantly looking at the door and at him, as if he was confused about something. Yan asked the young man what he thought was suspicious. They opened the door and Bailan replied that there was nothing in the room at all, except for an ice-cold spiritual pearl lying on the surface of the coffin. Master Yan thought for a while and smiled as he closed his eyes. He informed his companions that they should get out of there. At the surprised looks of his interlocutors, the mentor explained that there was no need to disturb that girl. He knows that. Master Yan confidently reported that that girl was lying in the sarcophagus for a reason. She is obviously waiting for someone. He didn't know who, but he was sure it wasn't the three of them. Tao couldn't accept that they would just leave empty-handed. After all, there were many interesting and unexplored things left here. She deliberately reduced her step and lagged behind a bit, then furtively glanced at her mentor, secretly hoping Yan would change his mind and decide to continue her search further. This did not go unnoticed. Mentor Yan noticed with a glance that the girl had fallen behind, but he didn't let on that he had noticed. Bailan didn't want to leave here without finding anything either, and discreetly turned around in the other direction, catching up with Tao. Without turning towards them, Master Yan simply extended his hand towards them. His palm was surrounded by a bluish aura, as if it was glowing from within. The same bluish glow enveloped one of the swords lying nearby. Tao and Bai saw the sword rise into the air and fly toward the master. Mentor Yan caught the sword by the hilt. He stood with his back to the dumbfounded Tao. The girl couldn't say a word out of surprise. Meanwhile, the master was making some strange movements with his sword. He seemed to be testing how easy it was to wield. The mentor furrowed his brow and sighed as he looked up at the sarcophagus steps. It was noticeable that he himself didn't want to leave here right away. Master said that his name was Zi Yan. He began to make circular motions with his sword, forming a vortex of flying blades. The master assured me that he had no intention of disturbing anyone's peace. After concentrating enough energy, Mentor Yan suddenly made a lunge with his sword in front of him, directing the yellow blades in that direction. Yellow blades densely dotted the area around the open sarcophagus with the girl, creating a protective barrier. Yan said that he had managed to rearrange the sword formation. Throwing the sword he had just found into the protective barrier, the mentor exclaimed, bringing peace back to the girl. The sword shattered into small pieces on impact. Tao Er was surprised to think that these were the sword aspirations that Master Yan had taught her. The only thing the girl could not understand was the reason for her sadness. She stood looking at the broken sword, full of thought. The girl was so lost in thought that she was startled when her mentor called out to her. He stood beside her, smiling, and extended his hand to the girl. Master Yan reminded the girl that there was nothing more to do here, and it was time to go. The girl looked at her mentor in embarrassment and timidly extended her hand to him. After what she had seen, Yan seemed like a god to her. The yellow blades guarding the sarcophagus were joined by silver blades. A melodious female voice was heard. A young woman began to sing a lullaby. She sang about not disturbing the half-sleep when you want to sleep and rubbing your eyes. It's better to just close your eyes and go to sleep. She walked over to the empty diaper and finished the lullaby to the end. As she lulled the baby to sleep, the woman said she needed to sleep. The woman's baby was round-faced and rosy-cheeked. He finally fell peacefully asleep in the young woman's arms, wrapped in a purple diaper. The woman from the sarcophagus in purple clothes gently held the baby in her arms and lulled it to sleep. She had a sad look in her eyes. The woman was held hostage to the situation. She could not get anywhere, and it was very depressing for her. She lost track of the days and hours. With the child in her arms, the woman walked towards the exit of the room. A magical barrier with golden swords stood in her way. The swords were now pointed in her direction. Now the picture became clear to the preceptor. He saw the girl in the sarcophagus and her child. The woman stood hesitantly in front of the barrier. Master Yan couldn't understand what was happening to him and where all these visions were coming from. After pondering for a while, he decided that a remnant of spiritual consciousness had decided to break into his dream. Master Yan took a closer look at the young woman and the child she was holding in her arms. It dawned on him that it was the girl from the coffin. The woman tried to break through the barrier and slowly pointed her index finger towards one of the yellow blades. The golden blade immediately pricked her finger until it bled, and the woman cried out in pain and surprise. She jerked hard, and the baby screamed, waking up. The girl immediately started lulling and soothing him. She persuaded the baby that there was no need to cry, because Mommy was here. She was always near. Everything was gradually coming together in the mentor's mind. Now the master realized that the barrier did not only protect their room from visitors. The magical barrier kept them from getting out themselves as well. It had worn them down to the point of exhaustion. The mentor saw the growth of the baby. At first, the child in his vision was crawling. In the next information fragment, a little girl in a purple sundress was already learning to walk under the guidance of a satisfied mother. The master saw a woman with a sleeping child in her arms. He realized that there was nothing strange about the fact that the room was empty. Mentor Yan looked sadly at his visions and concluded that the mother and child had eaten everything they could eat. The girl could not even sit up, let alone walk, because of hunger. Her white, sickly face spoke for itself. The girl complained to her mother that she was hungry. The woman held the girl in her arms and coaxed her to sleep. The mother stroked the girl's head and looked sadly at her daughter. She asked the girl to close her eyes and sleep. The woman promised that they would surely find something to eat later. The daughter obediently closed her eyes. After waiting for the girl to fall asleep, the young woman stood up with her in her arms. Her look was different now. The woman was determined. She had enveloped herself and the girl in a halo of flame and now walked purposefully across the room as if embraced by fire. The radius of the flame was quite large. From his position, Master Yan could see it clearly. The halo guarded the girl at a distance of several meters. As a mentor of the Temple of Heaven's Will, he realized something else as well. The woman had performed an unusual ritual called releasing the original spirit, or soul ignition. The girl with the baby in her arms ran straight towards the magic barrier. She ran as fast as she could. The child's life depended on her now. Master Yan turned pale. It didn't enter his mind that someone could use such a risky method just for the ghostly chance of saving a child. The woman ran up to the magical barrier before his eyes, covering the child with her body. She paid no attention to her wounds now. The girl had to be saved. Nevertheless, there was a breach, and shards sprinkled onto the wizard who was standing ankle-deep in water in the illusory sea. Mentor Jan turned around and looked at the girl. He smiled and congratulated the purple-clothed woman for finishing the case. The woman in the purple dress stood in front of the master. He told the girl that her scheme had turned out well. The woman folded her hands and bowed. Zi Yinqing introduced herself to the mentor. She said that she wanted to ask him for a favor. Yinqing said that more than 200 years ago, she and her daughter were separated, and the woman still did not know the fate of the girl. She begged the master to help her in her search. Master Yan replied that it would be quite difficult, and asked the woman to provide additional signs. The woman smiled with the corner of her lips and apologized for the trouble. Yingqin raised her hand up and bent 3 fingers, leaving the index and middle fingers. The woman said that the girl had only 2 special features. She detailed that her daughter had a red mole on her collarbone and a birthmark on the top of her buttock. The woman smiled and said that this was an easy task. Master Yan smiled back and asked the woman not to rejoice prematurely, for only the heavens could help him in his search. Yingqin thanked her mentor once again. He looked at the woman carefully, as if there was something left unsaid, and smirked. There was an awkward pause. Mentor Yan brought his face closer to the woman's face, and the woman looked at the master in surprise. She felt uncomfortable at the sight. The master smiled, looked Yingqin in the eyes, and asked how she was going to pay for the services rendered. The purple-clothed girl blushed even more. She asked if she understood the master in the same way. Yan explained that he wasn't going to help her for nothing and needed a reward. An embarrassed Yingqin recognized that the mentor was right and rightly demanded a reward for her labors. Unfortunately, she had absolutely nothing to offer Yan. But after thinking for a bit, he remembered something, and Yingqin's eyes went wide with surprise that it hadn't occurred to her before. She remembered that there was an ice-cold spiritual pearl in the secret room protecting her physical shell. Yingqin said that Yan could have it for herself. The mentor laughed and said that this unnecessary thing was of no use to him at all, as it was just a worthless piece of ice. Yingqin was confused and offered to take back her sarcophagus. She assured that her coffin was made of refined solid jade from the heavenly realm. The preceptor rejected this charge as well. He explained that all the tiles that line the Temple of Heavenly Will are made up of this material. Shyly, the girl offered to take her clothes. It was created by an outstanding craftsman and has resistance to fire and water. But the mentor refused such an offer as well. He assured the girl that he himself could create such clothes if he wanted to. Yingqin was ready to cry. She took the bracelet off her hand and held it out to the master. Yan turned away and said that it didn't suit him. Confused, the girl came to the lowest thought. She simply had no other choice if she wanted to find her little girl. Covering her lips with her hand so Yan wouldn't see her suffering, Yingqin went to the extreme step. She made it known that Yan could use her body as he wished. The mentor himself blushed. He had not expected such an immodest proposal from the girl. The master was surprised that the girl was really ready to do anything for her girl. Yingqin turned around and started running away from him, sobbing along the way. She screamed that this body was still capable of giving birth to several babies. Master Yan tried unsuccessfully to stop Yingqin, reaching out his hand and hoping to hold her back. Yan shouted in her wake that he wouldn't have fallen so low even in his thoughts. The dream was so real that the master woke up. Mentor Yan was lying in his bed and stretched out his hand just like in the dream when he tried to catch Zi Yingqin. Only now did the master realize that he was finally awake. He stretched and sat up on the bed, leaning on his arms. Yan crawled over to the window and leaned against it. It was still dark, and the street was lit by the streetlights outside the house. He resentfully said that he was only joking and told himself that he would try to find her daughter. 2 weeks had passed. On this day, the sky was very overcast, and the rain was pouring down in a thick wall. It seemed as if it would never end. The disciples of the Temple of Heavenly Will took shelter from the rain in one of the gazebos near the main building. The gazebo was large so that the rain would not get inside. Tao sat and enjoyed the treats. She devoured the cakes with both cheeks. There was still a full plate. The girl said it was delicious. Bai Lan drank the tea in a sedate manner and asked the girl to take her time. There were still plenty of sweets, and she would still have time to savor them. Tao had no time to speak, so she just nodded her head. After disposing of another cake, Tao asked her fellow student brother if he knew when Mentor Yan would be back. Bai replied that the master would be back soon. Besides, the weather outside was so foul that studying was out of the question. Sending another bite of the treat into her mouth, the girl with her mouth full tried to participate in the conversation. She looked at her fellow student and thought Yan was right about Lan's clothes. Bai really does change a lot when he puts on a woman's dress. Without looking at the plate, Bai Lan reached for the cakes, but his fingers only fumbled with the bottom of the plate. He turned to the girl in confusion. Tao Er was embarrassed and admitted that she had been daydreaming and had eaten every last crumb. She was embarrassed that she hadn't left a single cake on her plate. Lanya smirked. He had rarely seen such a sweet tooth, able to dispose of any portion of sweets in a matter of time. Smiling, Bailan leaned over to the girl and sternly asked the girl why she had let herself eat all the cakes. Tao was caught off guard by the question. Bailan smiled and told the girl that those cakes were meant for the master. They were his favorite sweets. Tao Er was ready to fall through the ground. She couldn't believe her ears. Stammering, she asked the young man in a daze if it was really her mentor's favorite treat. Tao almost roared in annoyance and reproached Lan for not telling her a little earlier. The young man said that it was no big deal. The master still adored Tao Er. Mo Junhin, who was standing nearby, raised his voice and Tao flinched in surprise. He said that he had an incident. 60 years ago, during the Moon Festival, Junheng carelessly ate a moon gingerbread that belonged to a master. Mentor Yan was so angry that he was ready to send the negligent student to the moon. He raged, and there was no end to his rage. Stammering, Tao Er turned pale and opened her eyes wide with fear. She thought that sending a disciple to the moon was an extreme, cruel measure. Wet from head to toe, Yuling peeked into the gazebo through the railing. He confirmed that the master was actually an extremely harsh person. The unexpected appearance of a fellow student startled Tao Er. Lin narrated that 32 years ago, on the 18th day of the 12th month, he had secretly tasted his mentor's fish soup. In a frightened voice, the fellow student added that as punishment, Master Yan had ordered him to be thrown into the frozen river. Tao Er imagined her fellow student's brother encased in a block of ice and rushing down a raging river. She felt uncomfortable and began to sob. Bailan laughed and said that the girl could relax because his master never punished for trifles like food. Tao turned pale and decided that she was definitely finished now. Mo Junhin remembered Bailan's childhood. Even back then, he already had quite a few women's clothes and looked like a little girl. Junhan recalled that Master had personally cut quite a few beautiful outfits into scraps. Bailan, embarrassed, turned aside. Mo Junhin saw someone and became wary. His expression instantly changed, his eyes staring at one point. In the distance, a mentor was approaching them. Mo Junhin saw him and decided it was best not to talk about him. Bailan stood with his back to him and asked what Junhin was implying. Mo immediately quickly started talking about how Master had made a lot of clothes for them. He was also quite nice to his students. Bailan didn't notice the mentor and cheerfully said that it was up to him to decide what he wanted to wear. It was his personal right. Bai started talking about how even a master's ban was not a problem. Suddenly, Master Yan grew right behind him and angrily asked what Bailan meant when he spoke of his mentor's prohibitions. Bailan turned white and said hastily that just one word from the master was enough, and his disciple would immediately obey the order without question. Master Yan frowned and replied that it was enough for Bayu to wear ordinary clothes and not stand out from the rest. Then Yan would treat him favorably as well. All three of Tao's fellow students suddenly snapped out of their seats. Bailan shouted that they all had some business to attend to. The girl thought that it wasn't good to leave her alone with Master. Mentor Yan meanwhile turned to the girl and called out to her affectionately. Tao Er prepared for the worst, but there was nowhere to run, so the only thing left to do was to reconcile. The embarrassed girl turned to her mentor. Her face was crimson with shame. Stammering, Tao Er wanted to say that she would admit her guilt, but she couldn't say a word. Master Yan looked at the girl and laughed. So comical was his young student's confusion. He understood perfectly why Tao Er was acting like this. It wasn't that fundamental to him. The master smiled and said that he was not so petty as to punish a girl for a couple of cakes. Tao Er remembered Junhen's story about how he almost flew to the moon and was surprised. It didn't fit with the fact that Mentor Yan wasn't that petty of a person. Still, Tao felt guilty and reported to her mentor that she had committed a misdemeanor. So the girl voluntarily asks him to give her a punishment. Mentor Yan immediately suspected a secret conspiracy and began to ponder over what those three fellow brothers might have said to her. He smiled at the girl and said that he didn't seem serious enough to give the impression of a strict man. But Tao Er was under the impression of Yuling's story about being thrown into the frozen river and shouted that this was the impression he was giving. The girl slammed her palm on the table. All of these punishments seemed very harsh and cruel, and she couldn't think of a softer one. She blushed and bent over, suggesting that the master use the same punishment as for Bai and spank her soft spot. Mentor Yan froze. This was definitely not something he had expected. He would never raise his hand against a female student, especially since she was not even guilty. The mentor stood there without saying a word. Tao Er perplexedly turned to him. She was sure he would accept at least this punishment. Master Yan stood there like a statue. The girl turned her head back and waited for a moment, then impatiently drummed her fingers on the table, attracting the teacher's attention. The confused Tao couldn't understand why Master Yan was hesitating. The girl was already tired of waiting, so she grudgingly called out to him. At this time, Mentor Yan simply froze in place and refused to believe his ears and eyes. His lovely student was offering to spank her herself. Yan was sure that he was still asleep. They both stood like that. Tao Er bent over the table, and the master frozen in the corner of the gazebo. Both were tormented by doubts as to whether this was the right thing to do. Tao Er thought too late that she should have thought first before offering her body to be flogged. She was already regretting having said that. The girl suggested that her act was very much influenced by the scene she had seen of her fellow student's brother Bai being executed. Tao Er wanted to hope for a miracle. Even though she urged her mentor to flog her, she secretly hoped that Yan wouldn't seriously beat her. Mentor Yan looked at her and trembled. There was no way he could raise his hand on the girl, much less Tao Er. Meanwhile, the two sides of the master were fighting amongst themselves. The little devil convinced him that this rare chance might be gone and he should enjoy it to the fullest. Mentor Yan blushed and began to listen to the dark part of his mind. His eyes lit up with sinister lights. The positive part of the master was convinced that the more reliable way would be to develop the relationship gradually. Mentor Yan was quite surprised that his conscience had awakened in him this time. It was distracting him a bit, and he didn't know how best to proceed. The holy part of the master thought about it. Something was bothering him. He decided to come to a compromise with the demon. They exclaimed with one voice that this time Tao Er had taken the initiative herself, and he, as a master, should grant his disciple's request. Mentor Yan became angry. He lost his train of thought and couldn't understand how his two different halves had come to an agreement without asking for his opinion. The master turned to Tao Er. The girl was still standing in the same pose and was ready to suffer a just punishment. Mentor Yan couldn't look at her for long and coughed meaningfully. He wanted to stall for as long as possible. Master hoped that Tao would leave on her own. The mentor informed the girl that he would punish her according to the rules. He really wanted to avoid all this, and Yan said he would stop if Tao was hurt. The girl was trembling with anticipation and the unknown, but she didn't want to show any sign of being scared, and proudly refused to indulge. Tao Er assured her mentor that nothing terrible would happen. She was well prepared for the fact that she was about to be flogged. The master had been looking at the girl's body for too long, and now he was paying the price by having his blood pressure rise and his nose bleed. He interrogated Tao one last time. The confused girl confirmed her willingness, and the master had no choice but to fulfill Tao Er's will. With a sweep of his arm, he prepared his palm for the slap. Mentor Yan thought that it really wasn't a big deal. Just as the master was about to strike Tao Er, he caught a glimpse of some movement from the side. He became alert and withdrew his hand from the strike. As if on cue, the satisfied faces of the three brats who had said something to his cute Tao Er came out of the bushes. Mentor Yan turned pale and never slapped the girl's soft part. He was embarrassed by the secret watchers, although he himself resisted the execution as much as he could. Realizing that they had been spotted, all three students ducked back into the bushes. Only a rustling sound told them that someone was there. Master Yan immediately came to the scene of their ambush and leaned over the conspirators. He said that all they wanted to do was stare. Mentor coughed meaningfully into his fist. He didn't know what was best to do. There was no punishment for peeping. After reprimanding the students, the master knelt down and explained that Tao Er had mastered 3 forms out of 36, but she still didn't understand what sword striving was. After thinking for a bit about who to summon, the mentor opted for Bai Lan. He called out to the young man, and Lan immediately stepped forward. He got into a fighting stance, retrieved a twisted silver sword from his belt, and made a few tentative lunges. Bai asked the girl to watch his movements carefully. He explained to Tao that the so-called sword aspirations had countless varieties, so there was no need to adhere to their exact form. Bai Lan concentrated at one point. He looked straight in front of him, gathering all his strength. Deciding that it was enough, he raised his sword above him in a quick movement. A blue glow appeared at the tip of the sword. Bai Lan continued to hold the sword, and the glow intensified, turning into a bluish vertical pillar. From the outside, it looked like a huge vertical pillar of bluish color surrounded by a halo in several places. It looked like a huge energy vortex. The pillar rapidly grew higher and higher. When it reached the rain clouds, it pierced them. A flash of incredible power lit up the whole sky. The rain stopped immediately and the first rays of sunshine appeared. Tao Er was simply amazed. Bai Lan was able to stop the rain with the thrust of his sword. Now the sky was filled with rainbows of all colors. Meanwhile, the young man himself stood in the circle he had created and enjoyed the sunlight. Throughout the rest of the area, the downpour continued to drum fiercely. It hadn't occurred to Tao before that sword movements could possess such beauty and sublimity. Master Yan smiled. He was satisfied with this demonstration. Bai Lan had indeed shown everything clearly and beautifully. After choosing the next disciple for the demonstration, the mentor barely turned to the other two and wanted to call out to Mo Junhen. Suddenly, Master Yan discovered that Mo Junhen was already standing in the right place. He thought in amazement that Mo had gotten there very inconspicuously. Mo Junhen stepped a few more steps forward. The pouring rain was not going to stop, and rainwater dripped from his straw hat onto his shoes. The young man smiled and explained that in the pursuit of the sword, weapons were not the main thing, and there was absolutely no need to dwell on his sword. Mo Junhen raised his index finger up and began to make the same rotating movements as if he was making them with his sword. Concentrating his strength in his index finger raised high above his head, Mo explained that he had long ago fused the aspirations of the sword within himself. Summoning his ghostly enlarged sword copy, the young man said that the aspirations of the sword had become part of his fighting spirit. With a single index finger, Mo Junchen summoned his battle ghost. No one knew what he could do if he had a sword in his hand. Junhen held his martial spirit, which was a 10 times larger copy of him, above his head. Seeing the huge impression he made on the girl, Mo smirked and became embarrassed. He was pleased with Tao Er's attention to his person, even if it was just for show. Mo Junhen continued to have fun with his battle ghost and laughed. Master Yan pulled Tao away from there and called for the next disciple. The girl was indeed very amazed. She was very astonished that a senior apprentice master was also able to release a primal spirit phantom. Yu Ling did not respond, so the master sternly called out to him. The young man timidly said that he was only engaged in tempering blades, and they had nothing to do with sword aspirations. He tried to convince his mentor that he couldn't do it in front of a woman anyway. Master Yan stood his ground and said that he had the ambition of a blade. The mentor cheerfully added that this would also do. Besides, Tao Er is his fellow sister, and Yu Ling has nothing to fear. The young man froze in place and held out his hands to the master, begging him to spare him from participating in the art demonstration. The mentor stared at him unwaveringly, and Lin understood. He immediately took off his seat and ran off somewhere. Tao Er was surprised that Yu Ling didn't explain anything. Master Yan smirked at the fleeing disciple. After running away a few more meters, Yu Ling took out his blade and hesitantly checked to see if he had lost his combat skills. The young man adopted a fighting stance and began to make circular movements with his battle blade. Each time he did so, he became more and more confident. During the preparatory procedure, Yu Ling looked up from time to time, as if hesitant to make the final leap. For a few more seconds, the young man swung his battle blade fiercely, preparing himself. He was now fully confident in his abilities. During one of the circular sword movements, Yu Ling quickly brought his weapon upwards. A blue glow immediately appeared on its tip. It was as if it was an extension of the blade. The sky was gray and overcast, the downpour continuing to terrorize the area. Suddenly, a powerful beam of light pierced the dark gray sky, and it began to dissipate little by little. Yu Ling had achieved an even greater result than Bailan. Whereas the third disciple had only caused the sky to enlighten locally just for himself, Lin had stopped the rain completely. He stood on the training ground by the gazebo and continued to swing his sword. The sky was almost cloudless and clear, and a bright rainbow appeared on it. Tao Er watched her fellow students' demonstrations with delight. Until this day, she had only heard about the sword's aspiration. Today, she had seen the blade's aspiration. The girl sat in the gazebo, bowing her head in sorrow. It was clear to Tao Er that she could only dream of such a level of skill. The girl grimaced at the thought that it would be too long before she could reach the level of her fellow students. The master understood Tao Er's feelings and caressed the girl's hair affectionately. He explained that there was no need for her to hurry. But she had to master the knowledge and consolidate it step by step. The mentor remembered that the girl still hadn't acquired a suitable spiritual sword, and that doesn't go in favor of realizing the sword's aspirations. Master Yan said that under these circumstances, they would go on a short trip again tomorrow. Yan added that it was just the two of them going. The girl blushed immediately. The mere thought of being alone with her master far away from the eyes of others made her blush. Luo Qinping's breathless body was discovered. The man dropped the earthenware set on the ground out of surprise. All the water poured out of the jug. Upon seeing the bloody body of his son, Schoolmaster Lucking cried out in a mournful voice and begged in desperation for his eyes to be opened. The servants immediately knelt down. They trembled and begged their lord to forgive them for not being able to prevent the trouble. The Supreme Master's hand came down heavily on the chair. With one blow, the man shattered it with despair and hopelessness. After breaking all the wooden furniture, the master called out to go immediately and find whoever had done this, by any means necessary. The servants trembled with fear. They fell down and were ready to fulfill any wish of the master, just to stay alive. In an aggressive state, the master was capable of many things. The master could not remember himself with anger. He cried out to the heavens and asked who could have dared to kill his son. Meanwhile, Master Yan was enjoying a trip together with the lovely disciple Tao Er. He was in a great mood. The mentor was very happy. His face spoke volumes. The mentor and disciple walked leisurely, holding hands, shortening the long journey with conversation. Yan couldn't contain his joy and smiled. This trip together was perfect. Besides, this place was very unusual. All along the way, they met pretty girls with hair of various colors, many of them with animal ears and tails. One of the girls in particular caught Tao's eye. She had large fox ears and her fingernails were shaped closer to claws. Tao Er thought it was not a healthy hobby. Master and Tao Er walked along the food rows. In addition to girls with ears and tails, there were centaurs and girls with snake bodies instead of legs. The girl was surprised by such an abundance of demons. She was attracted by the unusual ears of those girls, and Tao's tails seemed so fluffy that she wanted to touch them. Master Yan asked the girl to calm down. He explained that it was perfectly normal for the city. After all, the presence of demons was what made the city special. The mentor clarified that they were on the grounds of Happy Land. In some sources, this place is also known as the City of Luxury. Yan explained that some people liked women like that. The mentor explained that, in this city, humans and demons could sort of exchange. Suddenly, to their surprise, they saw a demoness with the head of a poodle. She looked at Tao scornfully, thinking that she knew nothing about men's hobbies. Master Yan couldn't help himself at the sight of the unusual full-breasted girl, and his hand trembled. Tao noticed that something was wrong with him. Blushing with embarrassment, the girl pointed her finger at that dog-headed demoness and timidly asked if he personally liked such women. The mentor was clearly caught off guard by this question, and he couldn't say a word. He tried to buy time and pretended not to understand Tao Er. Pretending to cough violently, he bowed his head and began urgently looking for a way out of the embarrassing situation. Raising his head, Yan said that they were here on business and there was no need to trifle. He explained that one of his city friends had recently mined some meteoric iron. Master Yan assured that such a material should be perfect for creating her spiritual sword of destiny. The girl didn't believe her mentor until the very end. She suspected that he was hiding his true intentions, but she decided not to show it and agreed with his words. On the other side of the street, a group of young people were walking toward them. A girl in a light green robe argued that it was a disgrace for humans and demons to talk to each other. She was followed by a young man in green robes with green hair and a girl in red. The young man cooled Yilin down and said that everything in the world has a reason, even this dirty place. The second young man, who was wearing brown clothes, said that the boy was right. They were only interested in meteoric iron here, and after the work was done, they would leave the city at once. He added that the demons were just lucky. If they had appeared in Tiansheng, they would have been killed immediately. The green-clothed girl was the first to see the master and Tao Er. She turned in their direction and began to watch them intently. After a few minutes, Yilin was sure she hadn't imagined it. She shouted happily that she had finally found the girl and rushed towards her, forgetting everything she had said before. Yilin was happy to meet Tao Er. Yilin shouted happily that she was very happy to see them and ran towards Tao Er with all her legs. The other three people in her company didn't understand anything and perplexedly reconsidered. Tao Er didn't see anything. She was very engrossed in her conversation with her mentor and was looking the other way, laughing contagiously. They both only saw Yilin at the very last moment and couldn't even say a word. So fast everything happened. Tao Er turned to the girl and was stunned. The girl was coming at her with the speed of a train, and Tao opened her eyes wide in surprise. Yilin rushed over to Tao Er and hugged her tightly around the neck. The girl couldn't understand what was happening. The mentor was also very surprised. Yilin hugged Tao Er and pressed herself tightly against her chest. Tao thought it didn't look quite right from the outside. Yilin happily told the girl that she could finally hug Tao Er. It was unusual for the girl to feel the soft touch of her sister. Master Yan immediately lost control of himself. His nose immediately started to bleed. The mentor thought that the girl was probably an acquaintance of Tao Er. Tao asked what little sister Yilin was doing here and asked her to loosen her grip. It was getting hard for the girl to breathe because of the tight embrace. Master Yan surprisingly asked the girl if she was Tao's sister. They were still holding hands with the girl. The enraged Yilin immediately smashed their lock with a strong blow and angrily asked who he even was and what he was doing here. Suddenly, she remembered that he was the one who had kidnapped her cousin. Yilin's demeanor now resembled that of an enraged tiger. Master Yan was too engrossed in looking at the new girl's figure and didn't immediately realize what Yilin meant. He wondered how the girl knew about it. Yilin struck a pose and rested her hands on her hips. She waited for an immediate explanation. Tao Er hurriedly told her cousin that she was wrong. Yilin yelled that they are in Pleasure City, if anything. And Tao walks down the street in an open dress, unafraid of guys hitting on her. The girl calmed down a bit and explained that she had gotten a tip from Su Xuan. According to him, Tao had gone to the Sea of Illusions to find a master. Tao turned around and pointed her finger at her mentor. She said that Yan was her master. Yilin looked at him incredulously. Yan smiled kindly. Yilin looked at the young man meticulously. She concluded that Yan was too young to be a martial arts master. Master Yan smiled kindly at Yilin and raised his hand, saying hello to the girl. She thought Yan was a handsome enough young man. Suddenly, Yilin smiled at her sister. She reported that everything was clear to her now. There was no trace of ill will left. Yilin voiced her guess that the master was just an excuse and actually Tao Er wanted to run away with this young man far away. Tao blushed at such a stupid idea. She started to justify to her cousin that Yilin was actually wrong in her assumptions. Yan asked in a friendly manner who this girl was to Tao Er. Tao turned to her mentor and hesitated. She couldn't talk about her relationship with Yilin. Something was stopping her. The girl raised her hand and introduced herself as Chung Yilin. She said that she was Tao Er's sister. Yilin looked angrily at the master. Yan realized that Tao Er's relative was really standing in front of him and made the right decision. He had to do anything to make a good impression. Mentor Yan bowed low to Yilin, folded his hands in respect, and said his name is Zia Yan Geju. He represents the Fate Pavilion. Yilin paid no attention to his etiquette. She simply walked closer to him and flicked his nose as if to suggest that he should be simpler. The girl immediately saw that he liked Tao Er and told him so. Yan and Tao were both surprised. Master realized that Yilin was very straightforward. Tao Er rushed to her sister and asked Yilin to calm down immediately. The girl glanced at Tao and continued to glare at the master with an insistent gaze. Hellfire appeared in her eyes, which did not bode well for her mentor. Yilin turned to her sister. At the same moment, she quickly grabbed Tao Er and pulled her to her. The girl didn't even have time to be frightened, as it was so sudden. Yilin said that she had to clarify something to them. Even if their love is mutual, Yan and Tao Er can't be together, and that's why Yilin is taking her with her. Meanwhile, Yilin was approached by her 3 acquaintances. They stopped at the girls' backs. Gawkers were beginning to gather around. Master Yan realized that he was suspected of all the deadly sins and hurriedly excused himself, saying that he and Tao Er were here on business. Everything is not what it looks like. He smiled and explained that Chung Yilin and Su Xuan simply misunderstood the relationship between the mentor and Tao Er. The young man with green hair assessed the situation. Since that girl called Yilin cousin, it could only be one girl. The young man's mind put all the pieces into one coherent picture, and he suddenly realized everything. The young man with green hair turned pale. He turned his head and whispered in the brown-clothed guy's ear that they were lucky today. That girl is the 6th child of the Su clan. The brown-clothed youth didn't believe his partner's words at first, and clarified whether he was really referring to the Su clan of the capital. Immediately he rushed over to Tao Er and introduced himself as Li Yuxia. He is the son of Vice Minister Li Ruoho of the Ministry of Service Affairs. Li assured that he was happy to see Miss Su. Tao was embarrassed and replied that the young man was much older for her, and so could simply address her as Tao Er. Meanwhile, a young man with green hair approached the master and introduced himself. He said his name was Nan Tianxing and asked how to address the master. Master Yan gave a friendly smile to his interlocutor and replied that his name was Zi Yan. He represents the Temple of Heavenly Will. The young man replied that he had heard a lot about the Temple of Heaven's Will. At that moment, another young man approached him with a quick step and pulled him aside. He immediately recognized Gaiju-san. Li walked over to the master and famously placed a hand on his shoulder. He warned his mentor that he should stay away from Tao Er because the rumors were not good. Since Yan didn't say a word, Li understood it in his own way and assured that he had never heard of his Temple of Heavenly Will in his life. He is definitely not worth Tao Er. The young man with green hair smirked and asked him to finish quickly. Yan had already figured it out. Li smirked as well and apologized for telling the truth. Master Yan was satisfied. Not only was Tao Er a worthy disciple, she also had a well-known popularity in the capital's circles. Meanwhile, Yilin continued to argue with Tao Er and asked her to leave with her now. Tao didn't understand the reason for her unfriendliness. Yilin tried to explain to her sister that it was in her best interest to leave with her now. If Tao stayed with this man, it would be worse for her. The embarrassed Tao Er once again tried to prove to her cousin Chung Yilin that she was mistaken, and her master did not belong to the bad people. Out of the corner of her eye, Tao Er caught the master's gaze. She realized that Yan was watching her and became embarrassed. The mentor assessed the situation. Apparently, in order to preserve her relationship with Tao Er, it was not worth it to get into a fight with her sister's friends. Yan decided not to get his hands dirty and spare those jerks. He politely turned to Chung Yilin and bowed to her. Yilin reluctantly turned around. Her face flamed with unfriendliness. Yan explained that he would allow Tao Er to stay with Yilin today since they hadn't seen each other in a while. But he would pick up the girl tomorrow morning. Yilin was angry and assured that Tao Er would stay with her anyway, and he should forget about his dirty thoughts. Tao Er was terribly offended by this. No one could decide for her what she could and could not do. All her good mood vanished in a flash. Tao Er pulled her hand out of Yilin's hand. She didn't understand why her sister had such a prejudice towards her mentor. Trying hard not to be rude to her sister, Tao told Yilin that she was not her mother. In addition, Tao decided to stay with her master. Mentor Yan extended his hand to Tao Er and asked her to listen to his advice. She just needed to spend some time with her sister. Yilin hummed proudly as if she made all the decisions here. Tao Er obediently bowed her head and said that she would obey the master's instructions. Tianxin opened a small homemade fan and looked through it at the mentor walking away. He didn't like that young man right away. The green-haired young man was angry. He had liked Tao for a long time, and no one had the right to look at her like that, not even this stranger. Li ran up to him and began to flatteringly assure his elder brother that he was a Seven Spirits level expert. Only a bachelor like Tianxin was worthy of Tao Er's hand. Chung Yilin imperiously grabbed her cousin's hand and suggested that she go get something to eat. Tao didn't want to leave just like that. She turned back around, secretly hoping Master Yan would change his mind and beat her back by force. Tao loved her sister, but now she was walking with her against her will. Yilin paid no attention to her resistance and dragged her further behind her, telling her off along the way. She hoped that Tao Er would come to her senses after all. Master Yan walked through Demon City and sadly looked around, taking it as a punishment. After all, it was already impossible to find a free room in the inn at this time. Now the mentor remembered Yilin's words. He had to admit that the girl was right. After all, Yan had really wanted to deceive Tao Er and say that there were only rooms for two. Suddenly, a life-saving thought came into his head. He remembered something. True, it wasn't exactly a good idea, but it solved the problem. Master Yan was wandering lonely in the City of Pleasure, and two girls had their eyes on him. They were watching him from afar when they saw that he was alone. The master walked around the square for a while and came to the realization that he could not find a room in this city because he was walking alone. That meant only one thing. If he could find a companion, he wouldn't have to worry about lodging. There were plenty of double beds in the City of Pleasure. One of the demonesses who had her eye on him approached the master and said a polite hello. The mentor blushed. That would not have been a good decision. The girl gently placed her hands on the master's shoulders and offered to come over to her place. Mentor Yan froze. He was still hesitant. Then another demoness with large ram's horns approached him. She took the young man's elbow imperiously and turned his attention to herself. She promised to provide such a range of services that would please him. Master Yan resisted. For Tao Er's sake, he didn't want to do that. But when he was surrounded by demonesses on all sides, Master Yan convinced himself that he simply had no choice, as he had nowhere to sleep. A man was sitting on one of the balconies nearby, watching the scene unfold rapidly. He was holding a cup of tea in his hand, and there was a kettle on the table. By some coincidence, this man turned out to be Bai Lan. He had put on a woman's dress again, and was watching his mentor with great interest. Lan noted happily that the master's weakness gave him power over him. The next time Yan wanted to spank him, he could easily threaten to tell Tao Er about it. At the moment when Lan was enjoying his tea, another disciple piled into the room. In a trembling voice, Yu Ling said that Bai Lan was simply terrible. Ripping down and falling into the pool, the young man shouted that Bai Lan was the truest traitor. Yu Ling scrambled back up and reminded him that Lan had simply lied to him. After all, he had promised the young man that they would just be friends. Yu Ling stammered with anger and resentment, and finally blurted out that Bai Lan was none other than the truest demon. Lan smiled appraisingly. He liked this compliment. One of the girls offered to visit their club. The girl with the horns interrupted her and said that she could find another guest and offered to go to her. The girl in the green dress moved her devilish ears, smirked, and announced that she suited the gentleman much more than the others. Now the master was faced with a choice. He didn't know who to favor. Besides, Yan had to behave more discreetly, for popularity was sinful. Shouting could be heard from downstairs. The demonesses were arguing with each other over who the mentor should choose. Lan thought contemptuously that these fools couldn't even do that. Yu Ling lay on the floor drunk and tried to say that the master was wise and prudent because he would never fall for such a thing. A surprised demoness stood beside him. Bai Lan stood with his back to them and snorted contemptuously. For Lin did not know the true state of affairs and did not see what Lan saw. Master Yan himself didn't know everything. He only knew that Bai Lan owned one of the brothels in Happy Land. Bai Lan squinted his eyes slyly. A black string with a pearl in the middle, matching the color of his hair, girdled his forehead. Lan smiled to himself. After all, Master Yan hadn't even realized that Bai Lan owned more than one brothel. He owned all the brothels in Happy Land City. As soon as Bai Lan learned that the master was left to himself, He ordered all the brothels to allocate the best dancers and promised to reward the girl who brought him to the brothel. So soon, another girl approached the fighting girls. She told her mentor in a sly voice that it was not a good idea to spend a wonderful night wandering the streets. Master Yan perplexedly turned around and looked at the new girl appraisingly. After all, he already had a choice for a place to sleep. Turns out the girl didn't come alone. There were several other demonesses with her. The violet-robed girl said that life was too short to waste. She added that you should spend your time in a meaningful way and enjoy every minute that life gives you. It seemed like the first girl only now saw the rivals. She was just shocked that so many of them had come, and she was angry. She shouted that she was the first to see the young man and told the others to stay out of her way. The second demoness shouted that everyone should have a chance to be with the man. The demoness shouted to the other girl that she had no right to pull her hair and called her sisters for help. Master Yan came back to reality and realized that he had to get away. In the midst of the fight, the girls suddenly realized that the object of their desires had disappeared and tried unsuccessfully to find him for some time. Master Yan was already quite far away. He suspected that the demonesses were hitting on him in droves for a reason, and that there was something behind it. Half-naked Yan wandered dejectedly through the city. He realized that now he would have to wander the streets of the city until morning. Suddenly someone whispered to him. Master Yan immediately realized that it could only be Tao and hurriedly got dressed. The girl looked out through the open shutters on the second floor. The girl invited him into her house, and Mentor Yan, having cleaned himself up, went to the front door. Master admitted that it was an amazing coincidence. After all, he didn't even know that Tao was staying in this room. Yan hoped that the girl hadn't seen anything. He was wrong, Tao could see everything clearly. She asked the master with interest if he was all right. Yan pretended not to understand the question. Tao then asked directly what kind of girls they were. Master Yan smiled and said that they had hit on him by themselves when he was looking for a hotel. The girl hesitated and asked her mentor to be careful, for in their time girls were ready to be eaten alive. She hesitated. Tao was embarrassed and told the master that it was very dangerous to be on the streets of the city at night. Tao was ashamed to say such a thing, but she was very worried about Master. The girl, red as a boiled crawfish, offered to let the master stay the night at her place, if it suited the mentor, of course. Master Yan himself blushed at the immodest suggestion. After all, he had only dreamed of spending the night with Tao. The mentor looked around. Suddenly he realized the reason for Tao's embarrassment. There was only one double bed in the room. Besides that, there was a table with a large mirror and many drawers. The girl blushed. She wasn't quite comfortable suggesting such a thing. Master Yan turned pale. He said, being a mentor and a man, they would just be misunderstood if they slept in the same bed. Tao, instead of answering, simply grabbed him by his clothes and pulled him to her, not intending to listen to all of his excuses. The mentor could not believe his happiness. He had reached his goal, albeit in a roundabout way, and found himself in bed with Tao. The girl stood in front of him in her nightgown. She embarrassedly said that she had nothing against it. After all, Yan himself had said that they were the same family. The master could barely contain himself. Yes, he remembered saying those words. He asked himself if he should listen to his heart and decided that he shouldn't. Naive Tao herself did not realize the storm of emotions she had caused in her mentor's soul. Yan looked at her with greedy eyes and stopped himself. The girl, as luck would have it, didn't want to disengage from him now. With tears in her eyes, Tao asked if Yan had any negative feelings toward her. Mentor Yan had only now agreed to share a bed with her. He tried his best to keep his cool and not think about his student lying next to him. Tao fell asleep immediately. She was safe. The master couldn't sleep. All he could think about was that he wasn't worthy of a girl like her. Tao moved through his sleep and called out to him. The frightened mentor turned pale. He couldn't sleep as it was. And then there was the girl with her questions. Turning to the master, Tao said that Yilin is a bit rude, but she is actually a nice girl. Tao asked not to be angry with her sister. Pensive, Master Yan stared at the ceiling and replied that he didn't intend to take offense at Yilin. After all, he knows that his sister is very important to the girl. The girl smiled and thanked her mentor fervently, wishing him a good night. Master Yan wished her sweet dreams in return. Yan was actually very angry. After all, he knew that he would hardly be able to sleep while being in close proximity to the girl. It was not the kind of picture he had envisioned. In his mentor's fantasy, they would fall asleep in each other's tender embrace. He had all sorts of bad thoughts in his head. As he turned to look at Tao sleeping peacefully, Yan thought about being a bad guy for a while. The girl lay so seductively by her side that Master Yan was willing to go to any violation of principles just to get her in his clutches. Suddenly, his good half with a halo on his head appeared and sobered him up with a powerful fist punch to the chin. The angelic part angrily explained that Yan had no right to even think of such a thing, for Tao simply didn't want her master sleeping outside. and nothing else. Yan took the hint and agreed with the angel's argument. He wished her good night and turned away in the opposite direction. Immediately, Master Yan opened his eyes. Something was obviously wrong. He had woken up again and was now unable to fall asleep or even doze off. The mentor couldn't understand what had happened to the blanket. Suddenly, he saw that it was all the fault of Tao Er's gentle hand that lay on the blanket at the master's side. Master Yan immediately imagined a desire-fueled Tao Er in a negligee. The girl naughtily showed him her tongue. The embarrassed Tao Er whispered in his ear that if it was to be done with a master, there was no shame in it since they were one family. Satisfied with himself, Yan lay back on the pillow and dreamed further. He couldn't believe that this was the moment when all his efforts began to bear fruit. The master flushed, his nose bleeding. He was glad that the flower, which had taken a lot of time and effort to grow, had finally bloomed. Without turning around, Master Yan hugged the girl. He was a little surprised. According to his observations, Tao Er should be a bit shorter. Pressing herself against him, Yilin whispered that Tao Er was very thin. It was only now that the mentor realized what had happened. Tao was sleeping peacefully. No natural calamity could save him from this girl, for next to him lay the rampant tigress Chung Yilin. When he realized this, the mentor was stunned. He had nowhere to go. He couldn't run away. Yilin might wake up, but there would be a scandal in the morning. Meanwhile, Yilin admitted to being very drunk and threw her leg over the blanket at the master's side. Now he had to endure even more. Chung Yilin got even closer and asked Tao Er to tell more about that young man. She was just bursting with curiosity. Yilin breathed passionately into her mentor's ear and asked if he was really Master Tao Er. Maybe he was still a lover to her. Yilin noticed that they were a little too close. Yilin hugged the master even tighter and laughed. She thought she had figured out her sister and the young man. Yan realized that he had to leave urgently before it was too late. Suddenly, Yilin tore the blanket off her mentor. An interesting thought occurred to her. Yan lay stunned and wondered what would happen next. Chung Yilin threw the blanket away and said that Tao Er would be punished if she found out that her sister was deceiving her. Yilin wrapped her arms around her mentor, still in absolute certainty that she was communicating with Tao Er. Chung Yilin tried to tickle him and elicit the truth. The girl tried to tickle him under his arms and on his back, but all to no avail. The mentor wasn't afraid of tickling. He was only worried about Yilin herself. Meanwhile, Tao Er was serenely sleeping next to her, not even aware of what was happening next to her. The girl was dreaming of a delicious fried fish, and she didn't care about her sister. Master Yan quickly got out from under Yilin and said hello to the girl. Chung Yilin slowly stood up. She was beginning to realize what was going on here. Yan confusingly began to explain his misadventures and told about how he barely escaped from those girls. As luck would have it, he met Tao Er by chance and stayed here. Such a story was very hard to believe, much less the suspicious Chung Yilin. Yan smirked and assumed that the girl didn't believe him. Of course, she didn't believe him, and decided to defend her sister's honor. Yilin immediately grabbed the sword sheath and pulled out the deadly weapon with a clang. The girl immediately slashed the air with her sword, aiming for his groin area. Master Yan barely had time to jump back. Yilin shouted that she wasn't buying this naive lie. She swung her sword once more, and the mentor had to crawl even farther away. Yilin shouted that he was just a pervert. Yilin sobbed. She just loved little sister Tao very much. Yilin promised the master to castrate him immediately. The mentor realized that he was already lingering in this house. Not wanting to abuse the hospitality any further, Master Yan reached for his cloak. Grabbing his clothes, the mentor shouted that he was really sorry for what had happened, and jumped out of the window. Furious, Yilin immediately ran to the open window, hoping to catch the master. She yelled after him that he should come back immediately, threatening the master with her sword. Ilian shouted that it was useless to hide. Wherever he was, she would find him and kill him. With her screams, Yilin woke up her sister. Tao sat up on the bed and asked the master why the room was so noisy. After wiping her eyes in her sleep, Tao Er realized the real reason. The aggressive Chung Yilin was looking at her. She called Tao a silly girl and asked what kind of noodles that womanizer had told her. At this time, Master Yan sat quietly on the roof of her house and listened to her speeches. If Yilin hadn't arrived earlier, she wouldn't have known that they slept together in the same bed. She rushed to Tao and said she had to examine her and make sure she was all right. Sitting on the rooftop, the mentor laughed at Yilin. He realized that her looks were deceiving. Despite her pretty face, Yilin is quite impulsive. It was late at night in the city. The streets were quiet, and not a soul could be seen anywhere. Even the brothel was empty. Master Yan carefully jumped off the roof, walked back a block to where he had met the demonesses, and carefully peeked out from around the corner. There was no trace of those girls left, and the dejected mentor realized that he would have to sleep outside tonight after all. Suddenly, Master Yan saw something suspicious with the corner of his eye and became wary. It looked like a human body. Mentor wondered what had happened to that man. and he moved even closer to get a better look at him. Recognizing this crawling and drunken citizen as his disciple Yu Ling, Mentor Yan was riddled with surprise and wondered what he wanted here. Finding himself at his master's feet, Yu Ling raised his head joyfully. Mentor Yan assumed that his disciple had lost his mind. The master gave the young man his hand, and the grateful Lin stammered and tried to tell him what he had done, but his tongue was too slurred, and Yan understood only that he had been thrown out. Master began to suspect bad things and assumed that Lin had been thrown out of the brothel that Bai Lan owned. Lin could barely stand on his feet and could only nod affirmatively. The mentor instantly remembered the girls who had offered him their services. It was not for nothing that he sensed that something was wrong. The master's face immediately became as if carved from stone. Mentor now saw the whole picture clearly. The sneaky Bai Lan had decided to set him up. Master helped Lin stand up and said that everything was clear to him now. Yu Ling had shown his true colors today. The young man looked at his mentor with gratitude. After putting the young man on his feet, Master Yan affectionately assured that he would help his disciple now, and Yu Ling began to thank his mentor fervently. Just then, Yu Ling realized that something not quite clear to him was happening at this moment, and wanted to ask the master what was wrong. The mentor grabbed his disciple's arm, untwisted him, and threw Yu Ling back to where he came from. Poor Lin flew and screamed on the way. After gaining the right acceleration, the apprentice was able to fly to the top floor of the brothel. He crashed into the wall with a loud noise. Moreover, Yu Ling's mass was enough for him to break a piece of wall with his body, and found himself in a room with two demoness girls. They were happy that the young man had been found. The girls started asking where Yu Ling had been. Yan stood outside the brothel and heard all this. He was pleased with himself. Taking advantage of the full moon and the deep night, some people visited the Divine Gorge. There was not a soul around. The purple-clothed man stood on the plateau near the Divine Gorge and looked at the nearby surroundings. Without turning to look at his interlocutor, Supreme Master Luo King asked if he was sure that his son was buried here. A tall man in a straw hat asked where the master got such distrust from. Master Loxin froze. He tried to look at his interlocutor. The man in the straw hat was Mo Junhen. He pushed his hat over his eyes with his finger so that he wouldn't be recognized. Junhen smirked and said that the master of Luo King School could dig up the body himself and make sure if he didn't believe him. 13 years ago, a momentous event took place. It was evening and an ominous moon was shining. All the trees were bare in this late fall season. Crows perched on the black branches and cut through the darkness with red, ominous lights. They knew they would soon have something to eat. An armed raid was carried out on peasant lands. The land was stained with blood. The villains did not spare even horses and slaughtered them. The exhausted horse fell to the ground and pulled the cart behind him. The wagon overturned with all its belongings. The wheel kept turning and creaking. The man noisily thrust his sword into the hard soil that was barely suitable for sowing and cultivating. It was hard for him to stand. The hostiles surrounded his family in a tight ring. The situation was very simple. The man could no longer resist. A few minutes ago, the outlaws had pounced on his wagon, and the man protecting his wife and small child was now holding his side. But the villains were wrong. With his last strength, the defensive man leaned on his sword. He managed to get up with difficulty. Overcoming the pain, with a groan, the man moved on his enemies. It was very hard for him. The man was getting weaker by the minute. His strength was leaving him so quickly that he could no longer hold his sword. The man felt as if he would fall off his feet in a little while. The child was screaming, and the frightened mother was soothing him as best she could. Mobilizing all his strength, the man rushed towards the enemies to give a final fight. The attackers looked at each other. It wouldn't take long. Smirking, they looked at the peasant who was coming at them openly. They simultaneously soared into the air and were about to fall on the unfortunate peasant and his family. Suddenly, a lightning flash appeared in the air. None of the enemies even had time to do anything. It was over very quickly. One of the attackers lost his head immediately. The other two realized that things were getting very bad and tried to flee. The unknown savior quickly dispatched them as well. One of the bandits was cut in half, and the other paid with his head. The sight was so bloody and brutal that the family had to turn the other way. Behind their backs, drops of blood dripped profusely from the sky. Meanwhile, a bright glow appeared in the sky, emanating from the index finger of a young man who was standing nearby, raising his hand high up above his head. The couple looked dumbfounded at their savior. Their faces were black from the soot of the fire. They couldn't believe they were alive. And besides, the method was very strange. The young man just stood upright and made rotating movements with his index finger. The man looked at the white-haired young man and could not understand how he was able to defeat 3 armed bandits without a weapon. The fight was over, and the young man was no longer needed here. He turned his head and turned his back to the peasant couple. As if to confirm his intention to leave, another severed head fell from the sky and ended up right at the peasant's feet. The peasants bowed to the young man and asked him to identify himself. The man asked how he could repay the young man and said he would never forget his kindness. Without turning around, the young man began to say that he was from the Temple of Heaven's Will, and his name was Z. He decided that was enough and stopped talking. The young man added that it didn't really matter. After all, he had just helped, and there was no need to pay for it. Immediately, he soared into the sky and was never seen again. A couple of peasants remained kneeling by the broken wagon with a child in their arms. They could not say a word to each other out of astonishment. The rosy-cheeked child did not understand anything at all at that time and so serenely sucked his finger in his mother's arms, not realizing how close to death he was. After carefully listening to the report of the man who entered, the purple-clothed Lord Lu sitting on the throne was very surprised. He assumed that the man was referring to Geju of the Temple of Heavenly Will, aka Ziyan. Lord Lu hesitated. The name was familiar to him. Nan was sitting with a fan as usual. He paid attention to the name mentioned in the conversation and realized that it was Miss Sue's so-called master. Nan couldn't understand what he wanted here. Tao Er also realized that it was about her mentor and was surprised. She didn't know that Master Yan had saved this man's family. Nan asked the Lord who this Zi Yan was. Lu explained that Yan is a longtime friend of his father, and he didn't expect Yan to come here. Nan's eyes lit up with a sly light. He decided to use what was happening to his advantage. Nan immediately began to improvise. He hinted to the Lord that an old friend of his father's might join the treasure appraisal meeting. Lu rejoiced at the interesting thought and ordered that the master be summoned to the assembly hall. Just then the door opened, and a man in white boots stepped into the hall. He entered the hall with a clear, confident stride, as if he were entering his own home. The man stepped a couple more steps and loudly reported that Seiyan Geju had arrived. He walked proudly through the assembly hall, and everyone turned their attention to the master. Nan squinted his eyes and drummed his fingers. He was not mistaken. And after all, this young man was the stranger from yesterday who called himself a master. Chung Yilin was furious. The very fact that this impudent man had appeared in their assembly hall angered her. She did not know the true purpose of his visit. The sweetheart of Master Tower's heart was embarrassed at his appearance, and her big blue eyes were just beaming with happiness. The master couldn't leave the girl unnoticed and winked slyly back at her. However, he also blushed at the sight of Tao Er. Master Yan approached the Lord and said his name was Sai Yan. He had heard that Lord Lu had discovered deposits of meteoric iron and hoped that the Lord would sell it. Yan explained that he needed the meteoric iron to make a special sword for his student Tao Er. The girl heard this and blushed. Nan said hello to the master and said that here they were, meeting again. Yan greeted Nan by folding his arms. Lord Lu looked at them with undisguised surprise. After all, they were both known to him as martial artists, but their paths were unlikely to cross. He asked Lord Nan if he knew the master. The young man replied evasively that they had met once before. Li smirked and said that he didn't expect to meet Geju here, as he had to go back to his farming. Nan smiled at his relative's joke. Lord Lu watched them carefully. He suspected that something was binding the three of them, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He had an interesting idea to use this conflict and put on a show. He grinned and drew attention to himself. The opponents stood gazing at each other, and at that moment an infectious laughter rang out. All three of them turned their heads toward Lord Lu. The Lord laughed deliberately loudly and informed him that he was glad to see Sai here. In fact, the subject of the meeting was just the meteoric iron he needed. Lu scratched his chin and said he could have just given that iron to his father's friend if it weren't for this meeting. Master Yan smiled. He knew what would follow next. Hard times or a favor needed or something else, just as long as it wasn't for nothing. Lord Lu gathered all the members of the meeting in the central courtyard of the manor and said that everyone should follow the rules now. The iron would belong to Yan if he won. He looked meaningfully at the master, letting him know that he would lose many privileges if he lost. His mentor looked at him calmly, smiling with only the tip of his lips. He was enjoying it a little. Nan emerged from the crowd and slowly approached the master, throwing a disdainful glance at him. He walked towards the center of the platform. Finishing instead of the Lord, Nan condescendingly informed the master that if he lost, Yan would commit to never appearing here again. Once, in the center of the arena, Nan shouted to his opponent that he was challenging him to a fight. The gawkers cheered and applauded. A dark-skinned giant entered the duel. He called himself Nije, a 17th generation disciple of the Wudong faction. The strong man accepted the challenge and greeted Nije. The young man greeted him back and smiled. This big Nije wasn't much of a problem for him. In the arena, the duel began. Li stood beside the master and revealed that Master Nan was a 7 spirits level expert from a noble family. Li added that the medal was very precious, and he advised Z to give up. Master Yan didn't say anything in response. He was very amused by this. Yan decided that he would participate in this performance. It would be good to amuse Tao Er. The girl herself was on the other side of the arena and waved at him. Yilin held her sister back. Meanwhile, a showdown was going on in the ring. The giant threw out his fist with all his might, but Nan easily dodged and struck his opponent's back with his ribs. The angry ninja turned towards Nanyu and immediately received a staggering blow to the chest area. The giant paused in surprise. Taking advantage of his opponent's hesitation, Nan twisted around and concentrated all of his power into his palm. When the moment was right, he lunged at the dark-skinned warrior and struck Ninja's body with all his might. Nanya's opponent bent in half and flew backward. All the gawkers watched in amazement as the dark-skinned fighter first bent in pain, and then with the help of an unknown force flew high into the sky, accompanying the flight with terrible screams. Only Nan was left in the ring. The spectators roared enthusiastically. They hadn't seen such a spectacle in a long time. The dark-skinned giant did not hit Nan once. Nan himself stood in a fighting stance and didn't smile. For him, it was just a job. Nan was ready to fight any fighter who challenged him. Lord Lu applauded. He really enjoyed Nan's performance. He loudly exclaimed that Master Nan was simply a legendary hero. Sneaky Lee couldn't miss his chance and shouted joyfully that Master Nan had won. Yilin was impressed with the fight. She said that it was an amazing fight. Master Yan looked thoughtfully at the victorious Nan, assessing his martial arts skills and probing for weaknesses. The spectators around Yan murmured. No one wanted to reconcile the fact that Nan had defeated only one opponent and was the hero of the day. They vowed to defeat Nan. Immediately, 2 fighters jumped into the arena and took up stands behind Nan's back. 2 more came out in front of him with a smirk. Nan stood with his hands folded behind his back. Nan smiled disdainfully and said that his esteemed opponents could do whatever they wanted, but they couldn't defeat him. The opponents began to wave their fists menacingly. One of them shouted that Nanyu should leave the arena, or he would teach him a lesson. Nan stopped smirking. He squinted his eyes, in which green ominous lights lit up, which did not bode well. In the same second, Nan revealed his fan, which he never parted with, and demonstrated a few moves, giving the fighters one last chance to escape unharmed. But this only enraged his rivals, and they all rushed at Nan together. The young men were sure that they would defeat him. In a few seconds, they were all on the ground. Satisfied with himself, Nan turned to the audience and looked at the spectators through the unfurled fan. He knew that he would defeat any of the people here. Nan smirked and proclaimed that he needed to defeat himself first if anyone wanted meteoric iron. Master Yan stood out from the crowd of spectators. He had seen enough and understood what his opponent was about. Now it was time to show his skills. Yan walked even closer to the arena. Nan continued to call out to all comers and announced that the prize would be given to whoever could beat him. A large sign hung on the meeting hall building, indicating that the entrance here was only for the brave and courageous warriors. The public discussed Master Z's persona. No one knew who he was. One man suggested that Yan was a fraud. Another said he just wanted to get a beating. Another tall man with a small goatee and a well-groomed mustache approached the arena. He turned to Master Nan and said that he didn't quite understand him. It was Yang Ling-ching, the leader of the Seven Knives sect. Everyone present understood that he wouldn't interfere just like that and smirked approvingly behind his back. Nan squinted his eyes and looked at Ching expectantly. The master continued and said that Nan himself was known as Tiansheng's best fighter with an excellent cultivation base. Nan stood holding a fan in his hands. Ching told the crowd about his rival, young Geju. He had heard that Si only had 3 disciples and could not compete with Nan. Nan allowed himself to relax and smiled. Immediately, everyone else laughed as well. It was quite clear that Yan was nothing special. Chung Yilin was sure that Yan would immediately show his true face as soon as he entered the arena. Tao Er felt that the master wanted to make a fool of himself. A loud voice was heard through the ringing laughter of the audience. Lord Lu's authoritative hand called for silence and quiet. Smiling at the audience, Lu told them that Yan was an old friend of his father. He asked them not to judge him harshly for coming here uninvited. Master Yan lost his composure and couldn't stand it. He pushed away the Lord's hand and interrupted his fiery speech. Lu perplexedly froze for a moment. Meanwhile, Master Yan headed straight ahead, about to leave the arena. The audience stood in a semicircle. No one was smiling now. Lord Lu squinted his eyes. He had finally succeeded in pissing off Z, and now he could use Master Nan to teach the insolent man a lesson. Nan watched the conflict unfold with interest. He had been itching to count Geju's ribs since yesterday. Suddenly, a powerful explosion sounded from behind Lord Nan. Even though he was standing quite far away from the wall, the blast wave caused the hair from behind to come over his eyes. Turning pale, Nan turned around. He had already realized that a serious opponent had appeared. It wasn't the bunch of youngsters he usually dealt with. The audience shouted in horror, the debris of the wall falling straight into the arena. Master Yan was the only one who stood still, keeping his composure. The dust from the explosion began to settle, and little by little, a few hostile silhouettes could be discerned in the dissipating fog. The first to emerge from the haze was a large man in purple robes. The rubble of the wall crunched beneath his wrought purple boots with the gold toe. The man moved quickly and confidently, his brown hair waving in the wind. He walked straight ahead, looking around at the assembled fighters. Many of the people present immediately recognized the powerful master. Lord Lu also recognized him. He exclaimed in surprise that he was a teacher from the Luo King sect, Master Luo Baiyun. Yes, it was indeed Master Baiyun. The recent loss of Qinping was reflected on his stern face, and the master had grayed a lot these days. Lord Lu didn't know what he wanted here, but it was in his best interest to show friendliness. Lu threw himself into Baiyun's arms and greeted him cordially, but instead of a smile on Master Lu's face, all he saw was a fierce gaze that just drilled into him. Behind the teacher were a number of selected fighters. Lord Lu realized that there was something wrong and froze in place. He could see that Luo Baiyun was very unhappy about something, so he tried to be polite. Lu bowed to the Luo King school teacher and slammed his fist into the palm of his hand as a sign of respect and appreciation to the master. Baiyun didn't even move. He continued to stare at Lu. Luo Baiyun continued to walk forward assertively. He had a long sword hanging on his belt. Baiyun reached the arena and stood in front of Nan. Lord Nan immediately folded his hands in respect and exclaimed that he was happy to welcome immortal Luo into their territory. Nan bowed his head and wanted to say that he appreciated the master, but Baiyun didn't listen to him and only slapped him carelessly with the back of his palm. Nan stood in his way. It turned out to be a very powerful blow for the young man, and he flew off to the side, losing 1 or 2 teeth on the way. The disgraced Nan landed awkwardly with his head down. By inertia, he dug a furrow of earth with his cheek, and this infuriated him even more. The onlookers immediately ran up to Nan. It was a shock to them. The angry Nan, lying on the ground, shouted that his father was the Grand Commandant, and Luo dared not do such a thing. Baiyun contemptuously informed that he was used to talking and laughing with the Emperor, Empress, and Grand Preceptor. Therefore, the Commandant meant nothing to him. The angered Nan looked at Luo resentfully, and the latter shouted that he wasn't going to waste his time on such a lowlife. It was only now that all the spectators began to realize what was really going on here, and what was threatening them all. Pushing each other, those present began to leave the place in a panic. Luo Baiyun stepped a few more steps and shouted, addressing Master Yan. He called out for Preceptor C to show himself to him immediately. The crowd scattered in different directions, trying to leave the arena as quickly as possible. No one wanted to fall under Master Luo's hot hand after what they had seen. Master Yan carelessly pushed away those who got in his way and leisurely stepped forward. There was not a single bit of fear on his face. Seeing the stranger, Master Baiyun shouted at him from afar. He assumed that the master was the Seiyan Geiju of the Temple of Heavenly Will, whom he was looking for. Master Yan smiled mockingly and said that it was him. He immediately realized that Master Luo Baiyun had come for his head, and this was even more interesting than the duel with Nan. Luo Baiyun shouted fiercely that it was Master Yan who was there in the Divine Gorge. His eyes were bloodshot, and he wanted revenge for his slain son. The angered Master Baiyun with clenched fists soared into the air and shouted that it was Master Yan who dared to kill his son Qinping. The audience hissed. Few people believed that Yan was able to kill his son. Someone told a neighbor that immortal Luo was a demigod and Zi's act was tantamount to suicide. Lord Lu gripped his head. He was desperately regretting that he had allowed Master Yan to be here at all. It was only a matter of time before Luo Baiyun got to him too. Chung Yilin turned pale. She now realized that the young man wasn't joking. He was actually skilled in martial arts. The girl whispered that Yan had killed him. Qiao'er stood with her back to her sister. This was all familiar to her, as she had been at the scene of the massacre herself. So she glumly told Yilin that the boys had asked for it. Master Yan realized that Bai Lan had disobeyed his order, for he had told the young man to dispose of the bodies. Master couldn't understand how Luo had found his son's body. The master realized that a fight could not be avoided and made a decision. He pushed himself off the ground and soared high into the air toward his opponent. At the peak of the jump, Yan flipped in the air and completed a somersault mortal at the feet of the Luo King School's master. Baiyun frowned at him, landing next to the master and as if casually falling down on one knee. Yan reported to him that he was Jie Yan. Baiyun said that Yan is quite young, but that didn't stop him from killing his younger brother Feng Shanfeng. Luo noted that the young man was very capable. Yan replied that he had simply taught his son poorly. His fault was just that. Luo Baiyun agreed that his son was indeed mischievous and unsophisticated. Placing his hand on the scabbard and starting to draw his sword, the master remembered that Qinping had humiliated a mother and daughter from the same family 10 years ago. The fighters surrounded Master Z and froze in a fighting stance with their swords out. As if nothing had happened, Luo said that his mother had risked her life to save her daughter, and they had both died. Master Bayun remembered the man who had all his clothes in patches. He fell on his knees in front of Luo and just begged him. The teacher said that later the father of the family came to his house with the bodies of those two women. A stretcher was standing right in the room. The bodies of the deceased women were covered. At that moment, Luo himself was ready to give him a generous amount of gold as compensation, but the man would not listen to him. He insisted on a just vengeance, a life for a life. Master Yan frowned and asked Luo what happened then as they separated. However, Yan guessed what Bayun had done. He just wanted to hear his confession. Luo looked disdainfully at Yan and wondered what he could have done next. After all, it was already obvious. Luo's warriors waited for the teacher's command and surrounded Z. Luo Bayun waved his sword and shouted that he had already taken the lives of many men, and it wouldn't cost him anything to kill another one. The negotiations were over, and it was time to deal with his son's killer. Bayun swung his sword at Master Yan and confessed that he had killed the man as well. The teacher of the Loking school stopped. He held the sword horizontally, supporting it with his other hand. The master created a powerful purple aura around him. This glow grew into a ghostly primary spirit phantom, a several dozen times larger replica of Master Luo. Large spikes could be seen on its shoulders and back. Undoubtedly, Luo Bayun had impressed everyone. He exuded such a powerful energy that his hair even rose up. The teacher of Luoqing School reported that Luo Qinping's actions were of no consequence. It did not negate the fact that he was Master Luo Bayun's son. He looked at his son's murderer with hatred and declared that all these mortal men gathered here were nothing more than ants. Luo Bayun shouted that his son Luo Qingping outshone them all and no one could match him. He made a powerful lunge forward with his sword. Repeating his movements, the primary spirit phantom also grabbed his sword and prepared to deliver a crushing blow to Master Yan. Teacher Z didn't seem to care at all. He calmly stood in the arena and looked up, watching Luo's phantom closely. Master Yan squinted his eyes and waited for the moment when he could counterattack his opponent. This time, he had a strong opponent. The primary spirit phantom summoned by Luo Bayun was inexorably approaching Master C. Just a little more, and he would be finished once and for all. The Luoqing school teacher's hatred was so strong that Bayun promised to not only feed C's dead body to the dogs, but also turn the enemy's spirit and soul into ashes. Lord Lu, forgetting his own danger, cheerfully shouted that Yan couldn't be from the Temple of Heaven's Will. The whole world would be better off without him. Tao Er was seriously frightened for the master and wanted to rush to his rescue, but Cheng Yilin held her hand just in time. Tao had tears in her eyes. She didn't want to see the massacre of her mentor. It was obvious that Luo Bayun was a very strong opponent. Suddenly, Master Yan spoke. He said that Immortal Luo was right, and these words, spoken in a normal voice, made Luo scared to death. Master Yan smirked and raised his index finger upwards. He agreed that it didn't matter at all whether there was one death or two. Master Yan touched the purple aura created by Teacher Luo, and it crackled loudly to the surprise of everyone present. Yan didn't stop there. He kept pressing on the protective shell, and the crack spread further and further. Yan promised to send Luo straight to his son. Mentor C concentrated his energy and directed it at Luo Bayun's phantom. The energy blast ripped off almost all of the phantom's fingers and shattered the sword. Bayun turned pale. Until this day, his phantom had never known defeat. Indeed, neither had his aggressive master. Luo couldn't believe that such a thing was even possible. It was only now that he began to take Mentor Z seriously and began to realize the true strength of the opponent who was able to overpower his son. Suddenly, he saw that another golden-colored phantom had grown beside his own phantom. This greatly surprised the master of the Losin school. After all, that second phantom was an enlarged copy of Master Yan himself, and Luo Bayun had assumed with fear in his voice that Z was a demigod. The golden phantom's sword whistled through the air and struck the phantom summoned by Master Luo. The phantom could no longer resist and took the blow. Then the golden phantom summoned a powerful electric discharge. When it reached the violet phantom, the discharge exploded and shattered Luo's phantom into tiny shards. Luo Bayun saw his phantom off on its final journey, shattering into small elements. Some of them floated in the air around him. The teacher was not frightened. He was only angry. They couldn't even wield a sword, let alone summon a primary spirit phantom. They were just screaming and begging for forgiveness. This scene stunned even Yan Lingqing, the leader of the Seven Knives faction. Standing beside him were Lord Nan and Lord Lu. They too were dumbfounded with horror. Cheng Yilin stared at the phantom melting into the sky in astonishment. She now realized that Master Yan could easily blow her brains out. Tao Er cheered. Her teacher was the strongest. When he was sure that the threat was over, Master Yan withdrew his phantom. He didn't need it anymore. Such a threat could be dealt with his bare hands. The mentor approached his assailant and asked if Luo Bayun was afraid. He felt that he could overpower him. Schoolmaster Luo King laughed gloatingly. He said that he wasn't scared in the slightest. The sword array of the Loking School was designed just for beheading demigods. Luo Baiyun immediately soared into the air and commanded all of his disciples to attack C together. All of the disciples had long been ready and were only waiting for the order. Out of the corner of his eye, Master Yan noticed how all the followers of the Luo school almost simultaneously jumped high and were on the same level as their teacher. Mentor Yan immediately realized what was going on. Together with their teacher, the followers of the Luo King school created a sword array consisting of 36 furrowing movements. Master Yan stood on the ground for now and looked at the array. He needed to find a weak gap in the enemy's defense. Suddenly, someone called out to him, and Preceptor Z was forced to look away for a while. He turned around, already guessing that it was Tao Er. It was indeed his lovely student Tao Er, and the hem of her dress fluttered as she ran, sometimes revealing more than the proper amount to other people's eyes. The girl's breasts were rising so high that they threatened to fall out of the wide neckline, but Tao Er didn't pay any attention to it. She had to save her teacher. Before she could run a few meters, the girl threw her sword at Mentor Z and shouted for him to catch it. Tao Er realized that every second was precious. Master Yan smirked and deftly caught the sword scabbard thrown to him. It was done in perfect timing. In the next instant, a horde from the heavens in the purple robes of the Luo King school was already rushing towards him. The first to rush was the offended Baiyun, followed by all the followers. Luo Baiyun shouted that Yan was about to die, and a multitude of swords flew at Mentor C. They flew in an endless stream, large deadly killing tools. Master Yan stood below and adopted a fighting stance, preparing for defense. There were too many swords, and the mentor doubted whether he could handle them all at once. But now he had a strong advantage. Master Yan received the sword. As if sensing his master's strength, the sword vibrated and shimmered in his hands. The mentor clenched his sword tightly in his hand and watched the swirl of swords approaching. He was waiting for the right moment. There was no hurry. The enemy cyclone was getting closer and closer. It seemed like just a little bit more, and only a deep crater would be left where Master Yan was standing. At the last moment, Yan suddenly straightened up and made a lunge with his sword straight towards the swirl created by the swords flying at him. His own blob of energy shattered the sword formation and crashed into the stream of Luo disciples with terrifying force. Their swords shattered into shards. Luo Baiyun continued to lead his team and rushed at wind speed towards the master. But now they had lost their advantage, and the master understood that. His disciples scattered, and Luo Baiyun tried unsuccessfully to stop them. All his followers were panic-stricken. Master Yan shouted to his opponent from the Luo school that the situation had changed slightly, and he now had a sword. Now the young man clearly understood what he must do to quickly defeat an opponent with superior numbers. Mentor Z concentrated and dashed upwards towards the enemies himself. He had to single-handedly decapitate them all, sparing no one. Right before Luo's eyes, the small jet emanating from Mentor Z's sword suddenly turned into a raging stream of energy that swept away everything in its path. Moreover, it was constantly expanding and causing more and more damage. After reaching Master Luo himself, the flood threw him far back. Flying backwards, Luo Baiyun shouted that this was simply impossible. No human could have such strength and wield a sword so skillfully. After flying around for a bit longer, the teacher remembered something else. This technique was very similar to the sword god style in execution. The powerful shockwave threw the Loking school teacher high above the forest. After flying for a while, the master began to fall downward. He landed heavily with his head down, causing a huge column of dust. Master Yan stood there and waited for his opponent to recover. Drops of blood fell from the sky. Mentor Yan walked over to Master Luo, who was lying on the ground, and put his sword point towards him. Droplets of blood continued to shower the ground around him. Luo Baiyun asked in a hoarse voice what Master Yan's relationship with the sword god was. The young man stood and silently looked at his opponent. Mentor Yan raised his sword over his enemy, intending to execute him and finally finish him off once and for all. His hand was firm. Luo began to beg and plead for forgiveness. He cried out that he couldn't just die like that. Baiyun promised to give him his treasure. Master Yan stood with his sword raised and listened to the story that all these treasures had been collected by the Luo King school for a long time. Luo Baiyun was just about to speak about how it would all belong to Master C, but he suddenly saw something and cut his speech short. A man in a straw hat approached them leisurely. It was he who showed them where his son's remains were kept. Mo Junhin slowly walked over to Mentor Z and carefully looked at Master Luo lying on the ground. Immediately recognizing the smiling man as his recent acquaintance, Luo Baiyun suggested in a trembling voice that they had set him up. Junhin corrected his straw hat with a habitual gesture and nodded towards Z. He asked if Luo wanted to know how Master Yan was related to the sword god. Mo Junhin winked at Teacher Luo and informed him that he himself was the sword god and Master Yan was his master. With a smirk, Junhin asked the Luo King school's mentor if he was satisfied with this answer. Luo turned green with anger, but there was nothing he could do now. Luo Baiyun rolled over onto his stomach and began to crawl away as fast as possible, loudly begging to be spared and let him live. Suddenly he was forced to stop. A living obstacle grew right in front of him. Someone in a white robe stopped in front of his face. They were Master Zi's loyal disciples Bai Lan and Yu Ling. Lan was wearing women's clothes and affectionately asked Luo if he was going far. Teacher Luo Baiyun leaned on his hands with difficulty and looked at his new opponents. He realized that he was in trouble. Nothing could save him from a just reprisal, for too much blood had been spilled today. All to kill the worthless Master Seo. Master Luo leaned heavily on his fist, and the ground around him shook from the impact. It was still hard for him to get up. Master Luo was saving his strength for the final blow. His eyes became bloodshot. The master said hatefully that it was his deepest regret that he had to admit defeat today. Suddenly slamming his hands on the ground, the school teacher Loking said that they would not get off that easily. A blast wave hit the ground, and the students were forced to flee. As a matter of fact, only Mentor Yan was running away. He ran as fast as he could, trying to get as far away from the dangerous place as possible. Master Yan suddenly crouched down and pointed his sword towards his assailant. A directed beam of energy flew at Teacher Luo. Bailan and Yu Ling barely had time to jump back in different directions and save their lives. The beam passed by at the speed of light and exploded behind Luo's back. Luo Baiyun still didn't understand what had happened. In a hoarse voice, he tried to ask Master Z what he had done to him. Master Yan stood with his back to him and realized from the sound that he had summoned an explosive primordial spirit of the highest level Lin Huang. Yan knew that he would not be easy to deal with. He began to put the still energy-pulsing sword back into its scabbard and said he was sorry for what had happened. A huge purple clot burst out from Teacher Luo's chest. It grew larger and larger right before his eyes. The teacher cried out in a pain he had never known before. Putting his sword into the scabbard, Mentor Yan exclaimed that he was already here and ready to fight the enemy. His eyes were full of determination. The dust stood in a column and slowly settled on the battlefield. Master Yan slowly walked away, leaving his defeated opponent behind. The once formidable Master Luo Baiyun, who was called Immortal, was now a pitiful sight. His eyes were rolled back and his clothes were torn to shreds. It was only now that all those spectators who had laughed at his mentor saw his true strength. The man who defeated the legendary Luo was worthy of respect. Cheng Yilin also had to change her opinion of this person. With astonishment, she said that Master Tao Er was a demigod. Tao Er walked up to the master and congratulated him on his brilliant victory. The girl couldn't be happy. She was very much worried about his life. Tao Er held out her hands, and Yan put into them the very sword she had thrown to him a while ago. He thanked the girl fervently. Without the sword, he wouldn't be able to overpower his opponent. There was a straw hat disciple standing at the side, and Master Yan sternly told Mo Juning that he had to explain everything to him. Mo corrected his hat and said that it was like that. He had deliberately lured Luo into a trap. After all, you have to let some people get rich so that everyone can achieve common prosperity. Junhen added that the sword god has been known to mankind for a long time, but only the initiated know that it has its own master. Mo Junhen declared that now was a different time. It was time to make the Temple of Heavenly Will famous and prosperous. The master shouted that he was just an idiot. Yan thought that Mo Junhen was trying to set him up and wanted to beat him up. The disciple had noticed that their Temple of Heavenly Will had avoided the world for years, and now it was time to create a good name for themselves. Bai Lan and Yu Ling barely restrained the mentor. Their combined efforts were not wasted. After a while, Master Yan accepted that they were right about something and calmed down a little. He regained his composure and said that they would not talk about it again. They'd better concentrate on the case now. Master Yan called out to Lord Lu. He turned pale with fear and bowed servilely to the man on whom his own life now depended. The mentor looked at Lu sternly and informed him that they could continue competing for possession of the meteorite iron since the performance was over. Lord Lu heaved a sigh of relief and assured that since this was the case, he was willing to provide legendary Master Z with whatever he wished. Master Yan smirked. He understood perfectly well what caused Lord Lu's behavior. He just wanted to get rid of him, but he had failed. Mentor Z walked to the edge of the arena and asked if there were anyone willing to fight him for a piece of meteoric iron. All the spectators turned pale. All those who had laughed at Sai a short time ago were now frozen in fear. After all, he might recall the offense he had caused and make them pay the bill with their heads. One of them immediately knelt down in front of Master Yan despite his high status. He assured that he did not mean to offend Seiyon Gaiju in any way. Without raising his head, Yang Lingqing told his mentor that he owned several properties in the capital, and he also had 23 concubines and maids. He exclaimed that 8 of them were virgins. Mentor Yan immediately pictured himself on the throne, surrounded by lovely girls on all sides. This fantasy made him slightly dizzy. Master Yan let himself relax and drew idyllic pictures to himself. Qing assured that they were all very good at their duties and offered them as a tribute if the master would spare him. Mentor Yan thanked Qing. Suddenly, Tao Er's overbearing hand blocked the master's path. She angrily shouted at Qin that he was a rascal and he wouldn't be able to insult her mentor in such a way. Yan looked at the girl with astonishment. The embarrassed Tao exclaimed that her master Yan was an educated and decent gentleman. Tao Er shouted with confidence that her mentor could not be bought by those ugly women Qing was offering. The girl happily turned to her master and made sure he shared her opinion. Tao was sure that her mentor could not think otherwise. All of Master C's hopes were shattered in an instant. Yan turned pale and hastily assured Tao Er that she was right, of course. He told Qin that he couldn't accept the gift. Bai Lan couldn't miss such an attractive moment. He smirked and thanked sect leader Qing for his kindness. He asked for the documents for the land and the beautiful girls to be prepared. Lan assured that he would accept them personally on behalf of the master. A trembling Lin said he would do everything. Neither Master Yan nor Tao Er had expected Bai Lan to be so bold. They were both surprised by the young man's impudence. Yan and Lan exchanged glances, and the disciple discreetly winked at Master Z. Yan thought happily that his dear disciple knew better than anyone what his mentor needed. Li and Nan were also kneeling on their knees, uncomplainingly awaiting their fate. Their fighters stood a little away, trembling with fear. Bai Lan slowly turned to them and scrutinized both of them. Not a trace of their recent insolence remained on their faces. Nan and Li just wanted to live. Bai Lan smirked gloatingly and reminded him that everyone here had just allowed themselves to insult his mentor by questioning his skill. Li realized that things were completely bad and immediately started begging the beautiful lady to spare him and not kill him now. Lord Nan was more understanding and said that insulting a demigod would never be forgiven. He accepted his fate and said that he would accept any punishment, even death. Li squealed that he was the son of an assistant minister and his person was inviolable. After all, Bai Lan would go against the whole of Tiansheng if he dared to kill Li. Bai Lan smirked and assured Li that his words didn't matter. After all, he would now kill him on behalf of his master, but the reprisal was not destined to happen. Bai Lan felt a hard slap on the soft part of his lower back and had to look away. He immediately realized it was the mentor. The young man instantly blushed and slyly asked Master Z why he had slapped him since they were in public. Master Yan was in no mood to joke. He didn't want any unnecessary bloodshed out of revenge, and Z hoped Lan would realize it himself. Mentor Yan menacingly asked Bai Lan if he wanted to repeat the recent flogging. The young man remembered that it had been very painful and hurtful. He hastily moved away from the minister's son and assured his teacher that he wasn't asking for a second punishment at all. He just wanted to make the best of it. Master Yan assured the young man that he shouldn't stoop to the level of those people. Killing them would only tarnish the sword. Lan turned around with hatred and exclaimed that they could both leave. In a matter of seconds, Nan and Li reached the high wall and swung over it in one fell swoop. The indignant Lan could barely contain himself. Meanwhile, Mentor Yan approached Lord Su and asked if he could finally obtain the meteoric iron since there were no challengers left. The Lord hastily assured that the prize belonged to him, Seiyan Gazhou. After all, it is only a piece of iron after all. Shivering in fear, Lord Su bowed and assured that he would bring it over right away. Master Yan turned aside and smirked. He had achieved his goal. After receiving his priceless cargo, the mentor summoned his disciples. Tao Er ran ahead of everyone, feeling boundless devotion to the master. Lan frowned at the master. Mentor Yan waited until they were all gathered and extended his hand towards the exit, hinting that there was nothing more for them to do here. 5 people were leaving the arena of the brave and courageous. Yan said that their work was done and was the first to head for the exit. The girl ran after him. The others leisurely followed behind. After loading their meteoric iron into the wagon, the travelers began their journey home. They decided not to stay anywhere and drove all night through the dark forest. The next day, Mentor Yan and Tao Er were already on their way to their home mountains. From there, it was a short distance to the Temple of Heavenly Will. Master Yan looked at the girl. He was very interested in one question, and he was thinking how to politely clarify something to Tao Er so as not to offend her. Finally, the mentor asked the girl why she had changed her clothes. He assumed that Tao Er no longer liked that dress. The girl smiled embarrassedly and admitted that she had given her clothes to Chung Yilin when she went home. She remembered telling her sister that those clothes could harness the essence of the universe and improve Yilin's cultivation. The girl timidly accepted Tao Er's gift. A teary-eyed Chung Yilin then said that the demigod himself had sewn this garment. Naturally, it couldn't be ordinary and had its own properties. Justifying her actions, Tao said that Master Yan was a very generous person and wouldn't mind her action. The mentor had no choice but to obediently agree. In fact, he regretted that he would no longer be able to admire Tao Er's form in that revealing dress. As if remembering something, the girl added that Xiao Ying would have a wedding next month. That's what Yilin had told her. Her mom will also be attending the wedding. Tao suddenly leaned over and rested her palm on the floor of the wagon. She was willing to do anything to get Master to let her go to the wedding. Tao Er fell to her knees and crawled over to the Master. Her face turned crimson. It was embarrassing for the girl to ask for a favor. But this didn't happen every day. Master Yan lost control of himself at this sight. A nosebleed opened up. He couldn't imagine that he would meet his future mother-in-law so quickly. The mentor gently stroked the girl's head. The confused girl raised her head and looked at him, waiting for his answer. Master Yan gave Tao Er a friendly wink and said that he would let her go. Moreover, he would personally keep her company so that nothing would happen on the way. The happy girl immediately threw herself into her master's arms and clung to him tightly. Tao Er warmly thanked the embarrassed master. The flushed Yan tried his best not to show how pleased he was with what had happened. He was one step closer to Tao Er. Meanwhile, Chung Yilin decided to try out Tao Er's miraculous clothes on herself and took off her green dress. Immediately, she started cursing Master Si. As soon as she put on Tao Er's clothes, Yilin immediately guessed the miraculous effect the dress had on the master himself. She blushed with anger and shame at the same time. Trying to cover her bare thighs and breasts in those clothes, the embarrassed Chung Yilin shouted that Master Yan was actually a lecherous thief. At this time, Bailan decided to have a little fun. He couldn't just let Li and Nan go. He tied those two scoundrels up and suspended them from the arc-shaped ceiling of the cave. Ignoring their cries, Lan assured them that he was obeying the master's orders and had no intention of killing them at all. Bailan asked them to be quiet and explained that their shouting might wake her up. Naturally, the young people didn't know who they were talking about. Lan revealed that this cave was inhabited by a horny humanoid bear. Her cultivation level could only be compared to a Xuanyuan-level cultivator. Bailan wished them both a good time. The boys looked at each other fearfully. Immediately, two red lights glowed ominously in the darkness. Bailan could hear their horrified cries even at a great distance from the cave. Smiling, he told himself that it was possible to abolish the death penalty, but it was hard to escape the living hell. It was a clear day. Bailan was standing in thought. A young man called out to him. He ran up to Lan holding a purple scarf in his hands. Bailan turned around. The young man said that he had carefully stored the scarf for many years, and today he could finally return it. Bailan touched the scarf in the young man's hands and noticed that the scarf was in immaculate condition. It looked absolutely as good as new. Blushing, Bai said that the young man had taken very good care of his scarf and asked if he wanted a reward from Bailan. The young man hesitated. He was not prepared for such an outcome and began to justify that he had just brought the scarf to his master and did not expect a reward. Bailan held out his hands to the young man, urging him to calm down. He gently looked at him and said that everything was fine. There was no need to worry. Bailan stroked the young man's face affectionately and said that he was worrying too much. He should just relax. Putting his arms around the young man and pulling him close to him, Lan whispered passionately in the young man's ear that he would do whatever he wanted. It was a bright new day. At the palace of the great instructor, the guards, as always, were valiantly on guard duty. In one of the buildings of the palace sat the same young man. He closed his eyes in pleasure and pressed a handkerchief to his cheek. His face looked embarrassed from the experience. The young man touched the handkerchief, and it was as if he was communicating with Bailan himself. He made excuses for not daring to be selfish. The young man still didn't have time to say exactly what he wanted. One of his men entered the room unannounced, and it took the young man by surprise. He barely had time to hide the unfortunate handkerchief behind his back and scolded the servant for not barging into his room unannounced. A servant reported to the young master that His Majesty had come to visit the second young lady, Miss Su Tao Er. The young man turned pale. The emperor had once again honored the palace of the great instructor with a visit. It was not in the young man's plans to meet him. The great preceptor's hall was guarded with such vigilance for a reason. A special person was there today, which meant that the spies would use this opportunity. On Emperor Yunwang's lap sat two girls with a dish in their hands. One of the girls asked how the lychee tasted to him. Yunwang assured that from their hands, any food was excellent. Not far away, Grand Preceptor Su and his wife were sitting in their chairs. The Grand Preceptor could not look at it calmly and bowed his head. He thought that His Majesty was too easily tempted by the lure of good looks. Su lamented that no one could have guessed how many misunderstandings this would cause. This morning, the Chancellor thought that His Majesty always came to the Grand Preceptor Hall because of his lust for Tao Er. Su's eyes blazed with anger. He didn't want to believe those rumors that Yunwang had really offered Tao Er to become an imperial concubine. In his heart, Mentor knew that Emperor Yunwang was unlikely to go for such a thing, and there was some misunderstanding here. He sat dejectedly enjoying tea with his wife while the Emperor amused himself with the young girls nearby. They laughed shyly at another joke. The Emperor turned to Mentor and told Olsu that he had visited him many times in the past 5 months, but had never seen Tao-er. He added that he spent the day and night thinking about her laugh and smile. The Emperor assumed that he would be able to meet Tao-er at least this time. Su Xuan stood and eavesdropped outside the door. He got angry and decided that the rumors were true after all. Emperor Yunwang had indeed decided to take Tao-er to his palace. The young man remembered that Tao-er had first seen the young emperor when she was only 10 years old. The young man remembered that Tao-er had first seen the young emperor when she was only 10 years old. Su didn't know what to answer and was a little slow to reply. He had to think of something immediately so that his answer wouldn't offend the emperor. After all, he actually had no idea where Su Xuan had sent Tao-er to, but the emperor waited patiently for an answer. At this moment, Su Xuan entered the hall and thanked His Majesty for showing concern. The emperor smiled. Xuan bowed and informed the emperor that he had sent Tao-er on a journey to improve her cultivation. Yunwang smiled and said that he was happy for Tao-er. He asked him to let him know when the girl would return. Then the emperor would send someone to fetch her. Xuan reported that the Su family didn't need to worry about such trivial things. He realized that the emperor wanted to lay his paws on his little sister. Xuan became furious and shouted that he would never tell the emperor about Tao-er's whereabouts in his life. The emperor was very surprised at such defiance. He stomped his foot with anger and shouted that Su Xuan was just a lousy person. No need to hide Tao-er from his emperor. Xuan replied that it was shameful of him to desire a girl younger than himself. He asked to find another girl. Old Man Su and his wife realized that this threatened to ruin the whole family. Mentor Su hurriedly alleviated the situation and hurriedly told the emperor that Su Xuan had misunderstood everything without having all the information. When he ascended the throne, there was a lot of intrigue in His Majesty's court. So for the safety of the children, he sent them to Su's house. The mentor turned to the young man and sternly informed him that he, Xuan-er, and his sister Tao-er were of the same blood and flesh as His Majesty. The mentor said that Xuan shouldn't be so rude. The young man took this as confirmation of his hunch and did not believe in his imperial origin. Su Xuan said that he only had one relative. The emperor's eyes became bloodshot. He was angry and decided to teach the arrogant young man a lesson. Xuan smiled and continued to say something about his relatives. His sentence remained unspoken. The emperor threw his fist in his offspring's face. With a powerful punch to his jaw, Su Xuan immediately fell to the floor. The emperor continued to stare at him angrily, assessing whether to add more. Seeing Su Xuan fall to the floor from His Majesty's blow, Grand Preceptor and his wife turned white with horror. All they had to do was pray that everything would go quiet. At the same time in the Temple of Heavenly Will, events were going on as usual. Tao-er was testing out her new shoes. Right now, her goal was to get used to the new heeled shoes. The girl's clothes had also changed, and the very thought of it made her blush. She was ashamed to even think about her clothes. Tao-er groped her clothes every few minutes, trying to cover up the overly bare parts of her body a little more, for her outfit was now more revealing. She made her way through the forest to the master's abode and opened the large wooden door. The house was in perfect order, so the door didn't even creak. The girl peeked through the door and reported to her mentor that Tao-er had put on a new dopo and was asking to see her outfit. Suddenly she saw something that the delicate maiden's eye should not have seen at all. Tao-er's eyes widened in surprise. Before her own eyes, Master Yan was sitting on the floor, while his loyal disciple Bai Lan was pulling off his blue cloak and undressing him. As far as the girl could see, the mentor didn't even resist. It was like some kind of game. Lan, smiling, said that his robe needed washing and volunteered to help. Master Yan shoved him away and told Bai Lan to stop prying. He looked like a filthy animal. The girl almost died of shame at witnessing this scene. She slammed the door shut with her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming in horror. Tao-er felt dizzy. Her face was burning and she didn't know what to think. Her imagination immediately came up with the continuation of the story. In it, Bai Lan asked the teacher if he smelled good and hugged him. And Master Yan replied that he liked good students like Bai Lan. Tao-er glanced angrily towards the house where she had seen the master and his disciple, and decided that her mentor had some strange tendencies. When the door closed, its flaps began to clang against each other. This caught the attention of Bai Lan and the master. They looked at the door perplexed.